You Will Not Stampede Me. Essays on Non-Conformism by CAPLAN. To Robin Hanson. If the world is against you, brother, then I am against the world. Part 1. Disobedience to Authority. You will not stampede me. During the last 20 years, I've lived through a series of public crises: 9/11, the Iraq War, the Great Recession, the Syrian refugee crisis, ISIS, systematic sexism, Me Too, systematic racism, and of course, COVID-19. In each case, society's demands have been the same. First, hysteria. We're all supposed to embrace fear and anger as the leitmotifs of our lives. Second, hurting. We're all supposed to not merely refrain from criticizing the popular view, but to fervently join the chorus calling for action. In each case, I have spurned the demands of society. I refuse to get hysterical. I refuse to herd. For any specific crisis I downplay, strangers usually assume a left or right-wing motive. Against the war on terror, leftist. I've even been publicly accused of being a communist. Against Me Too, rightist. Those who know a bit about me suspect libertarian wishful thinking. I pretend the world is fine in order to deny the need for decisive government action. In that case, though, shouldn't I grant the severity of the problems, then blame the government? A better story is that I'm a contrarian. If most people are incensed about something, I go out of my way to be blasé. To quote the misanthrope, what other people think, he can't abide. Whatever they say, he's on the other side. He lives in deadly terror of agreeing. 'Twould make him seem an ordinary being. Indeed, he's so in love with contradiction. He'll turn against his most profound conviction, and with a furious eloquence deplore it, if only someone else is speaking for it. Though I love to read these immortal lines aloud, I deny that they describe me. My position, rather, is that society is consistently wrong. Though the details vary, there are two crucial constants. First, hysteria is absurd. Second, herding is reckless. Let me elaborate. To paraphrase the world's best graduation speech, trying to figure out what's going on while high on negative emotions is as effective as trying to solve an algebra equation by chewing bubblegum. Of course, if you're the sole person hysterical about your cause, you'll probably do no harm. But when lots of people are hysterical in the same way, they generally wreak havoc. That's right, I stayed calm on 9/11. When Americans started calling for blood on 9/12, I saw horrible writing on the wall. Though not as horrible as the writing turned out. Without the Iraq War, we probably wouldn't have had the Syrian civil war, ISIS, the refugee crisis, Brexit, or Trump. Aren't the public crises I named extremely heterogeneous? Sure, in some ways. The Great Recession directly caused massive global harm. Almost all of the damage of the war on terror, in contrast, was indirect, the product of a massive overreaction to a statistically tiny evil. Nevertheless, these diverse public crises also share crucial similarities. Most notably, 1. Almost no one carefully measures the severity of these crises until the crisis is practically over. Instead, what drives perceptions is availability bias, well-publicized, emotionally gripping anecdotes. The correlation between these anecdotes and the actual size of the problems is low at best. 2. Almost no one seriously asks what, if anything, would be a well-tailored response to this crisis. Instead, societies embrace action bias, rushing to do something, flailing about wildly, then gradually lose interest until the next crisis. Perhaps we're already doing enough about terrorism? Will invading Iraq make things worse? Maybe we shouldn't collectively punish refugees or males or whites because a few bad apples do awful dramatic things? If coronavirus is 10 times worse than flu, perhaps we should make 10 times as much effort to combat it, not 1,000 times. All reasonable questions, yet impotent in a crisis. If I were in charge, would I have done much better? Though I'm well aware of my own self-serving bias, I believe I would have done much better. I wouldn't have fought the war on terror, not even in Afghanistan. I would have met the Great Recession with nominal GDP targeting and labor market deregulation, not bailouts and fiscal stimulus. I would have welcomed refugees from the Middle East. I would have enforced existing laws against rape and murder, not start witch hunts for systemic sexism or systemic racism. And I would have met coronavirus with moderate caution, not shutdowns or putting 10% of the workforce on welfare. Yes, perhaps I'm mistaken about one or two of these crises. What is clear, though, is that society's method of certifying and addressing crises is deeply defective, and that's highly unlikely to change. While I've got to live with that, I get a small sense of comfort from staying aloof from the madness, staying aloof and quietly thinking, "You will not stampede me." August 17th, 2020. The identity of shame. Every large, unselective group includes some villains. Say whatever you like about the average moral caliber of Christians, atheists, Democrats, Republicans, plumbers, comic book fans, or Albanians. The fact remains that each of these groups contains some awful people. While this isn't logically necessary, it is an iron statistical law. If X has more than a few dozen members, and you can join Group X by A being born into X, or B saying, "I'm an X," then X will have some unsavory characters. When you identify with a large, unselective group, you expose yourself to two dangers. First, some of the villains in your group may take villainous actions that make you look bad. Yet on reflection, that's a minor concern. Yes, the bad members of your group make you look bad, but the good members of your group make you look good. The second danger is more severe. Once you identify with any large, unselective group, you will be regularly tempted to commit the villainous act of standing up for your group's villains. When they do wrong, as they inevitably will, your impulse will be to ignore, minimize, or justify their misdeeds. To quote the underrated 8mm, "If you dance with the devil don't change. The devil changes you." Look at any large, unselective group you don't identify with. You see them clearly, do you not? Some of its members are plainly bad people, but getting the regular members to unequivocally condemn their bad members is almost impossible. Evolution has honed their my-side bias for millions of years, and that's not about to change. Fortunately, there are relatively easy ways to avoid these temptations in the first place, to save yourself from all shameful identities. Namely, never identify with large, unselective groups. Instead, restrict your identity to groups that are small, selective, or both. The nuclear family is the classic small, unselective group. No other group is more deeply founded in human nature. Fortunately, the moral risk of being part of such a family is usually small. Even if you have 5 kids, there are a good chance that none of them will be horrendous people. Circles of friends are the classic small, selective group. Pick your friends carefully, and you probably won't end up an apologist for evil. Large, selective groups are riskier. In principle, they can evade statistical villainy by carefully vetting and excommunicating questionable members. Unfortunately, my-side bias tends to gut the excommunication process. Fringe movements like Jehovah's Witnesses expel members all the time, but not the Catholic Church. The best way to guard against this laxity is to define your large, selective groups in purely intellectual terms. Identify with liberalism or conservatism, not liberals or conservatives. This is the kernel of truth behind the no true Scotsman fallacy. Once you insist that no true libertarian believes in immigration restrictions, you'll feel little temptation to ignore, minimize, or justify libertarians who believe in immigration restrictions. And this is precisely how you should feel. Can anyone really live up to my puritanical advice? Yes, take me. I identify with my nuclear family, with my friends, and with a bunch of ideas. I neither need nor want any broader identity. I was born in America to a Democratic Catholic mother and a Republican Jewish father, but none of these facts define me. When Americans, Democrats, Republicans, Catholics, and Jews commit misdeeds, as they regularly do, I feel no shame and offer no excuses. Why? Because I'm not with them. October 30th, 2014. Being normal. I've always been weird, but at this point in my life, I feel like I understand non-weird people quite well. If you're still baffled, my weird friends, one simple principle captures most of what you need to know. The principle of normality. A normal person says what others say, but does what others do. Notice that this principle captures 2 distinct features of normality. First, conformism. People dislike expressing views or taking actions unless other people express the same views and express the same actions. Second, the chasm between words and actions. Normal people lack integrity. They feel little need to bring their actions in harmony with their words, or their words in harmony with their actions. Example, a normal person will say, "We should do everything possible to fight global warming," yet donate zero to environmental charities. How can they cope with the cognitive dissonance? Because this psychological experience is alien to them. They speak environmentalist words to echo the environmentalist words they hear other people say. They donate zero to environmental charities to mimic what they see other people do. What is this dissonance of which you speak, weird one? For normal people, social desirability bias is far more than a bias. It is their way of life. Once you understand the principle of normality, my weird friends, you are also ready to look in the mirror and understand weirdness in all its manifestations. While some weird people exhibit multiple manifestations, most weird people strongly emphasize just one, I think. Manifestation number 1. Saying unconventional things. Some weird people like speaking about odd, off-putting, or socially disapproved topics, despite strong social pressure. Picture the comic book nerd, the gaming nerd, the literary nerd, or the anti-religious nerd. They still live much like other people. They just say weird things. Manifestation number 2. Doing unconventional actions. Other weird people focus on doing odd, off-putting, or socially disapproved things, again despite strong social pressure. Picture the polyamorist, the punker, the Hare Krishna in Western societies, or the junkie. They still speak much like other people. They just do weird things. Manifestation number 3, the integrity of good. A third variety of weird person starts with plausible, even popular verbal premises. Then they stun the rest of the world by striving to bring their behavior into strict conformity with these premises. Picture the effective altruist, the vegan, the abolitionist, or the proponent of radical honesty. Manifestation number 4, the integrity of evil. The last variety of weird person starts with bizarre verbal premises that seem absurd unless you're thoroughly brainwashed. Then they horrify the rest of the world by striving to bring their behavior into strict conformity with these premises. Picture the Islamic fundamentalist, the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary, or the theonomist. To point out the obvious, manifestation number 4 is responsible for almost all of the political horrors of the last 3 centuries. Most weird people are not violent fanatics, but all violent fanatics are weird. So while I'm personally high on manifestations 1, 2, and especially 3, I can understand why weird people tend to frighten normal people. In defense of the weird, however, I have to point out that most moral progress comes from manifestation number 3. The abolition of slavery being the greatest example. Normal people rarely initiate awful crimes on their own, but once violent fanatics make awful crimes normal, normal people will support them by word and deed. November 10th, 2020. Why be normal? Economists love to pour cold water on new ideas. If your plan is so great, why aren't people already doing it? And usually we're right to do so. Most of the economy's backseat drivers aren't fit to run an apple cart. But still, there are a lot of ideas that seem to hold up to intense criticism, but the market still doesn't adopt them. Case in point, why don't workers offer employers a money-back guarantee? I'll work for free for a month. If you're not completely satisfied, you'll never have to pay me a dime. Do minimum wage laws forbid this? Well, they don't forbid unpaid internships. So call the money-back guarantee an internship, and away we go. This plan sounds particularly appealing to people like me who believe that education is mainly a signal rather than a place to acquire job skills. So why don't we see this? Here's my answer. Suppose you're interviewing a smart guy without a college degree, and he offers you a money-back guarantee. You might think, what a great deal, and accept. But then again, you might start thinking, what a weirdo, what's wrong with him? And this, I propose, is the stumbling block to lots of worthwhile innovations. A person with an unconventional idea may have a point, but is also unlikely to be normal. He may not fit in with other people. He may have problems with authority. He may be deviant in more ways than one. Confession, I'm one of the weirdos. I flout all kinds of social conventions. I wear shorts and flip-flops in the winter. I carry a funny cushion around wherever I go. Don't ask. I laugh at inappropriate times. So outside of the best weird economics department in the world, who wants to hire me? If you hear me out, I think I've got some good arguments for wearing shorts and flip-flops in the winter. But even if I convinced you, you would probably hesitate to hire me, especially for a real-world job. My failure to conform in dress significantly raises the probability that I will fail to conform in more substantive ways. And even if you decide I can wear shorts while everyone else wears suits, what if a client sees me? He may start to think the whole firm is weird. My argument about normalcy is an example of what economists call statistical discrimination. In a world of costly information, employers sensibly rely on a lot of statistical generalizations. One of these, I'll warrant, is that weirdos are on average worse employees than conformists. Admittedly, the truth of this probably varies from industry to industry. Check out Peter Jackson. But typically, usually, normally, normality is the best bet. The upshot is that some clever but unconventional ideas sit on the shelf, untried. March 2nd, 2005. The Outsider Advantage. Judean People's Front? We're the People's Front of Judea. The Life of BRYAN. Ned, have you considered any of the other major religions? They're all pretty much the same. Reverend Lovejoy, The Simpsons. Intellectually speaking, how far apart are each of the following pairs? 1 Democrats and Republicans, 2 Catholics and Protestants, 3 Sunnis and Shiites, 4 Trotskyists and Stalinists. My conditional prediction of your answers hinges on how you see yourself. For each pair, tell me if you strongly identify with either side. If you say yes, I predict you will think the difference between the two sides is vast. If you say no, I predict you will think the difference between the two sides is modest. My reasoning. All of these pairs are, in the broad scheme of things, variations on a theme. Democrat and Republican are both variations on American nationalism. Catholic and Protestant are both variations on Christianity. Sunni and Shia are both variants on Islam. Trotskyist and Stalinist are both variations on Marxism-Leninism. All you need to see these truths is some intellectual distance. As long as you're an outsider, you're well positioned for objectivity. Insiders have a corresponding disadvantage. Their identity hangs in the balance. If the differences are minor, there's no good reason to strongly prefer one side over the other. And if there's no good reason to strongly prefer one side over the other, why have they in fact embraced one side as their own? Talk about cognitive dissonance. As an insider, of course, it's tempting to rebuke outsiders for their ignorance. If they understood the issues, the outsiders would realize that the world really does hang in the balance. And in any case, if the differences are minor, why are their rivals attacking them so viciously? The outsider's answer, of course, is the cynical one. There's nothing to explain. Human beings passionately fight over trivia all the time. If Catholics and Protestants could fight the 30 Years' War over religious minutiae, why is it so hard to believe that Democrats and Republicans are polluting Facebook to determine which variant on nationalism and social democracy is the one true way? The problem, as usual, is that insiders are too emotionally invested in their group identity to see how trivial their differences really are. April 7th, 2015. Lip service. Individualists such as myself are often accused of being psychologically oblivious. Look around. The vast majority of human beings crave community and belonging. Social thinkers who refuse to account for this obvious fact may be smart and articulate, but they don't know what they're talking about. I agree that most individualists are psychologically oblivious, but so is almost everyone. The problem is not individualists, but psychology. The replication crisis notwithstanding, psychology is a tough and subtle subject. We can't directly observe anyone's psychology but our own, and our self-descriptions are corrupted by our desire to impress others. Each person's intimate familiarity with his own psychology helps, but also misleads because we're so quick to generalize from our person to all mankind. Assertions about humans' intense craving for community and belonging are a case in point. The surface problem: the humans who energetically defend these claims tend to be exceptionally communitarian. That's why they're so outspoken on the topic. The fundamental problem, though, is that community and belonging sound good, leading to rampant lip service. How can I say that? By noting the stark contrast between how much people say they care about community and how lackadaisically they try to fulfill their announced desire. I've long been shocked by the fraction of people who call themselves religious, who can't even bother to attend a weekly ceremony or speak a daily prayer. But religious devotion is fervent compared to secular communitarian devotion. How many self-styled communitarians have the energy to attend a weekly patriotic or ethnic meeting? To spend a few hours a week watching patriotic or ethnically themed television and movies? To utter a daily toast to their nation or people? Indeed, only a tiny percentage of people who claim to love community find the time for communitarian slacktivism. You could argue that coordination costs explain the curious shortage of intentional communities. But nothing stops secular communitarians from matching the time commitment of suburban Catholics. Well, nothing but their own apathy. The lesson: while individualists do tend to neglect mankind's craving for community, they err on the side of truth. Actions really do speak louder than words, and actions reveal that people are far less communitarian than they claim. May 5th, 2016. What will the neighbors say? How signaling ossifies behavior. Suppose you suddenly discover a far better way of doing X. Your discovery uses fewer resources, yields higher quality, and even has more positive externalities than ye olde standby. There's just one catch. Your discovery is a discovery. By definition, no one currently does X your way. In many cases, you can shrug, say "so what," and proceed. If your discovery is eating a mango a day keeps the doctor away, go for it. But open-mindedness often bites the hand that feeds it. If other people, A, are watching you, B, will take your new behavior as a sign of nonconformity, and C, value conformity either instrumentally or intrinsically, then what will the neighbors say is a serious question. And any serious question is a serious reason not to adopt your discovery despite its merits. For example, suppose you discover that Star Trek uniforms are cheaper, more comfortable, and safer than conventional clothing. Before you switch to full-time Trekkie wear, you would be wise to ponder other people's reaction to your fashion statement. If you're even vaguely connected to mainstream American society, that reaction would probably be very negative. You'd probably lose your job, your friends, and maybe even your spouse, if any. Why? Because you're acting weird, and most people loathe the weird, or the correlates of the weird. Once you take conformity signaling seriously, it's easy to list other negative inferences the neighbors might draw about you if you deviate from ye olde standby. When you start doing something different, perhaps your neighbors will say that you are arrogant, reckless, disrespectful, traitorous, impious, or crazy. The list goes on. While it's conceivable that the neighbors will instead call you brilliant, clever, forward-thinking, or progressive, that's usually wishful thinking. As any anthropologist will tell you, human beings are conformists through and through. Goths strive to mimic their fellow Goths, hippies their fellow hippies. We are the sheeple. The lesson: in the real world, signaling naturally tends to ossify behavior, to lock in whatever the status quo happens to be. If you're an optimist, you can protest. It's only a tendency. But even an optimist should admit that this tendency leads to atypically slow and unreliable progress. P.S. I am not merely making a thinly veiled argument against the prospects of online education. My point is general, and I embrace it generally. January 21st, 2013. Motivating sheep. Perhaps the greatest truth about human nature that you do not find in the typical economics textbook is that people are sheep. Most human beings don't like to be different from the others around them. They want to fit in, to look, sound, and act normal. Perhaps the best discussion of this is in Gaetano Mosca's The Ruling Class. The urge to be normal is most obvious in K-12 education, when conforming to changing fashions becomes a full-time job. But adults are basically the same, just a little more subtle. How much would you have to pay typical adults to wear shorts at a formal gathering of people they are sure to never meet again? How much would you have to pay the typical man to wear a dress? But if people are sheep, doesn't it undercut a great deal of economics? Economists are always arguing that you can change behavior simply by changing prices. But if people are desperate not to be square pegs, they might lack the courage to switch to currently unusual behavior just because the pay is better. In fact, I'll warrant that if you pulled people at random out of a crowd and offered them decent money to do something weird, most wouldn't do it. That's precisely what an interesting paper in Public Choice by Werner Guth and Hannelore Vec Hahnemann found. They gave randomly selected students a chance to sell their vote for a fair bit of money. And even though many of those students didn't vote, very few were willing to publicly take the cash. It is not too difficult, however, to reconstruct economics on a sheepish foundation. All we need to realize is that there are degrees of sheepishness. In any society, 5 or 10% care primarily about money, not what other people think about them. Or perhaps they reason that once they're rich enough, people will think what they want them to think. When prices change, the money-focused people change their behavior. That makes changing behavior less weird, which makes slightly more sheepish people willing to change their behavior. And that reduces the stigma further, and so on. Unless the initial stigma is overwhelming, then it is easy to get big swings in behavior, even though most people are suckers for peer pressure. Thomas Neshiba's model of welfare and illegitimacy is a nice example. Who would have thought that paying unwed moms for out-of-wedlock births would have led to a lot more of them? Was AFDC really such an attractive deal, considering all the social disapproval unwed moms still faced? The weakness in this argument is that some women were swayed by money, which reduced the stigma, leading more potential moms to change their behavior. And off we go. Economics should recognize that people are sheep because it's true, but I believe it would also improve economic pedagogy. When economists explain the effects of rent control, for example, it can sound a little paranoid. First, rent control, and before you know it, landlords are setting fire to their own buildings. A more plausible story is that rent control leads a few landlords to unscrupulous behavior, which makes it seem more normal. You get the idea. The Lone Collectivist. When you're a normal member of your society, the appeal of collectivism is easy to understand. Most people believe what you believe and enjoy what you enjoy. So wouldn't it be great if society as a whole continuously celebrated your worldview and lifestyle? When you fit in, walking on eggshells to spare minority sensibilities is most tiresome. If you're weird, in contrast, the appeal of individualism is easy to understand. Most people neither believe what you believe nor enjoy what you enjoy. You already feel isolated and alone. Public celebrations of popular values add insult to injury, especially when these celebrations are infused by the presumption that these are the values that we as a society hold in common. Strangely, though, weird people often hail collectivism and scoff at individualism. Marxists do it, Greens do it, and reactionaries do it. They're totally out of sync with their societies, but they nevertheless lament their society's lack of community spirit and common purpose. A country shouldn't just be a bunch of people living next to each other, is a typical lament. But weird collectivists rarely ask themselves, what would happen if I couldn't live next to anyone who didn't share my identity? The unwelcome answer, of course, is that Marxists, Greens, and reactionaries would have to recant or relocate. I'm tempted to say that this is just another mark against the claim that self-interest drives political views, but I sense more sinister motives. Namely, weird collectivists have a 3-step daydream. Seize power. Step 2. Use that power to tendentiously claim to speak for society. Step 3. Force their worldview's lifestyle on their recalcitrant societies in society's name. Think of these 3 steps as the revolutionary version of society. Stop hitting yourself. Stop hitting yourself. Stop hitting yourself. Perhaps this is overly negative. But what else could the lone collectivist be thinking? His true feelings about the community in which he resides must be, at best, mixed. In 1,000 ways, the lone collectivist's community keeps telling him, "You don't fit in." If he isn't fantasizing about a world where he can authoritatively speak in society's name, why else would the lone collectivist openly yearn for cohesive community? Stockholm Syndrome? January 27th, 2015. You're fired. Firing a worker is usually a serious harm. Sometimes it's devastating, but we can still wonder, is firing someone morally wrong, and if so, how morally wrong? If you're puzzled, ponder this. Ending a romantic relationship, too, is usually a serious harm. Sometimes that, too, is devastating. Yet few moderns attach much moral blame to someone who dumps their romantic partner. Even if you're married, we rarely claim anything like, if you break up, your ex-partner will wallow in misery for years, so you have a moral obligation to stay. Close family members might privately maintain otherwise if you have kids together, but even then. In my view, firing is morally comparable to ending a romantic relationship. In the absence of a formal agreement to the contrary, both kinds of relationships are, and should be, at will. Yes, insiders might have some grounds to morally criticize the termination. Ultimately, however, close relationships, whether professional or personal, are complicated, riddled with misunderstandings. Hence, outsiders should not only affirm that people have a right to unilaterally break up, they should practice the virtue of tolerance by remaining impartial in thought as well as action. To repeat, that's my view. The normal view, in contrast, is that romantic and professional relationships should be governed by diametrically opposed standards. In matters of love, the heart wants what the heart wants. On the job, in contrast, governments should protect workers from employer abuse, and even if the law says otherwise, firing someone who's performing their job adequately is morally suspect. While this normal view is now widely shared, it's still closely associated with the left. When freedom of contract had more appeal, the left strongly argued that employers' freedom to fire was tantamount to the freedom to oppress workers. Back in high school, my social science teachers often philosophized, sure, physical coercion is bad, but so is economic coercion. If your employer can fire you whenever he likes, you're not free. This outlook naturally inspired the left to advocate a wide range of employment regulations, especially anti-firing rules. While most non-leftists also favor such regulation, the left has long been more intense about it. Their attitude is more radical, and so are the regulations they support. Which makes sense. If you earnestly believe that firing a worker is a kind of economic violence, you're going to firmly support stringent legal scrutiny of this violence. From this perspective, the rise of cancel culture is deeply surprising. Over the last decade, many leftists have not just moderated their former stance against firing, they have become enthusiastic advocates of firing people they dislike. He's performing his job adequately, so you have no right to fire him, has strangely morphed into a right-wing view. If you don't believe me, just start making insensitive remarks about race, gender, and sexuality on social media and see how your career goes. I was perfectly civil at work. I only offended on my own time is now a frail defense. Even if your boss and coworkers adore you, plenty of left-wing activists will still pressure them to sack you. Again, I have no principled objection to firing workers for their political views. Indeed, I've long defended the blacklist of Hollywood's communists. While I tolerate a wide range of opinion, totalitarians are beyond the pale. While we have no right to jail them, they don't belong in polite society. But if, like most people, you embrace the view that firing a worker is economic coercion, the left's newfound love of firing their enemies should weigh on you. Consider, their revised stance amounts to something like, firing a worker who's performing his job adequately is a form of violence, and if anyone crosses us, we advocate, nay, demand, that this violence be done. To be fair, many leftists have yet to revise their stance. Yet as far as I can tell, very few leftists are publicly reaffirming their opposition to firing workers for what they do and say on their own time. Perhaps because they're afraid of experiencing economic violence at the hands of the many other leftists who don't take kindly to such talk. July 13th, 2020. Should economists go to finishing school? People don't like economists, and they don't listen to us. Economists who want to influence public opinion often connect the two problems. Maybe if we had tact, manners, and warmth, we wouldn't turn off our audience. And if we didn't turn off our audience, it would listen to us. All this time, we thought economics was a tough sell. But the only thing we really need to make the world listen is a diploma from finishing school. There is something here. Few economists radiate the compassion of the Dalai Lama. Those who do get a better reaction from the general public. By speaking with humility and showing that they care, they reach their audience in ways that uncouth economists like me never do. This is an interesting hypothesis, but it's probably false where it counts. The problem I've noticed with the well-groomed approach to economic education is that it makes the audience like you more, but understand you less. If you refrain from bluntly stating economic truisms, you make more friends. But they are your friends because they don't grasp that you are defending socially unacceptable conclusions. There is no nice way to tell people they talk too much. Similarly, there is no nice way to tell people that the minimum wage causes unemployment. If a normal person is still smiling after you make your point, he probably didn't get it, because the conclusion is inherently unsettling. One of my favorite examples, I gave a 90-minute lecture on the minimum wage to my intro econ class. It seemed to go over well, but afterwards, I felt a little guilty. Big man, browbeating a captive audience of freshmen, I thought. Then I gave the midterm, and found that only 2 out of 25 understood the basic point of my lecture. Barely 5 even realized that my lecture on the minimum wage had been critical. How could I have communicated more effectively? Should I have made my initial lecture more genteel? Negative. Then no one would have understood me. The solution, rather, was to be more blunt. I was, and by the final exam, only 2 or 3 still didn't get it. But what good does it do if the public understands you without liking you? Only a little. But if economic education is your goal, it is far worse if the public likes you without understanding you. Once people know your position, there is at least a chance that they will start wondering if you're right. The people who want to send economists to finishing school have their hearts in the right place. Economists do need to communicate more effectively with broader audiences, but I think their diagnosis is wrong. The main reason that the public doesn't listen to us is not that we are boorish, but that we are boring. Think about the typical economist on TV. Why do your parents change the channel? It is not because he offends them, but because he puts them to sleep. And this is good news, because it means that economists are currently below their communication possibilities frontier. By being blunt, economists can bore less and teach more. In other words, we can increase both the amount that people listen to us and their likelihood of grasping our point. Better still, it's a fine line between blunt and funny. If you speak your mind plainly, people often laugh. That means, 1, they aren't bored. 2, they know what you mean. And best of all, 3, they start to lose a great impediment to understanding economics and the world, the gut-level feeling that popular opinion is sacred. May 7, 2005. We Rule, a Socratic Dialogue. You look troubled, Glaucon. I'm tired of all the lies, Socrates. What lies do you have in mind? Did you witness the festival of barbaric thought? No. Did I miss anything? Hardly, but the whole Athenian elite was there, oohing and ahhing over the paltry achievements of mere barbarians. Did you criticize them for their lack of discernment? How I wanted to. But they'd have called me a son of Hades if I'd spoken the truth. The truth that their festival was a farce. I suppose that would have galled them too, but I have a far greater truth in mind. Namely, that civilization rests upon Athenian achievements. Objectively speaking, we Athenians rule. Whatever the barbarians have, they owe to us. And you think everyone ought to know and admit this? Exactly. I'm puzzled. Most of the Athenians I know haven't contributed anything to civilization. Don't be dense, Socrates. I'm not claiming that the average Athenian is a great thinker. I'm claiming that the great thinkers are Athenian. Not all, Glaucon. Think of the brilliance of Adelwin the Vandal. Yes, I am well aware of Adelwin's accomplishments. My point, obviously, is that great thinkers are disproportionately Athenian. A few outstanding barbarians do nothing to vitiate this point. True enough. But why then do you say that civilization rests upon Athenian achievements, or that barbarians owe us anything? Glaucon, have I not made myself clear, Socrates? We Athenians have built civilization. Without us, the barbarians would be even more barbarous than they already are. Socrates, perhaps I am simply slow-witted, Glaucon, but answer me this. How many Athenians have been great thinkers? About 300. Very well. And how many barbarians have been great thinkers? Very well. But 50. Socrates, why then do you say that barbarians owe civilization to Athenians? Isn't it as obvious as your bald head? Socrates, not at all. What's obvious as my bald head, if your numbers are correct, is that mankind, Athenian and barbarian alike, owes civilization to 350 great thinkers. But 6 out of 7 of those great thinkers were Athenian. How is that a legitimate source of pride for the vast majority of Athenians who are anything but great thinkers? So the citizens of Athens should kneel before these great men. I didn't say that. But if you want to give credit where credit is due, you should say not Athenians rule, but that great thinkers rule. No doubt you count yourself among these great thinkers. It's presumptuous to say so, but suppose I did, would that be so terrible? Absolutely. Being a great thinker is no excuse for bad manners. So it is bad manners when the great alert the not-so-great to their unequal achievements. Indeed. Was it not then bad manners when you declared that Athenians rule? I wasn't proclaiming my personal achievements. I was proclaiming the achievements of the Athenian people. I see. So it would be rude to call attention to my own brilliance, but acceptable to call attention to the brilliance of brilliant people in general. No, that's even worse. You should identify with fellow Athenians, not great thinkers. But do we not owe civilization itself to these great thinkers? Ha! Where would these great thinkers be without the mass of people to implement their ideas? The great thinkers earn ample rewards in the market. They shouldn't think themselves entitled to popular adulation as well. Could we not say the same about the Athenians? Whatever do you mean? Socrates, the barbarians pay us for our products, bringing great riches to Athens. Why should we expect them to augment their gold with gratitude? Without Athens, they'd be nothing. Socrates, it is far more to the point to say that without great thinkers, mankind would be nothing. But even that is a half-truth, for without the rest of mankind, great thinkers would be too preoccupied with menial labor to advance civilization. Great and mediocre minds alike profit from this specialization in trade. Or so it seems to me. Perhaps one day a great thinker will put my conjecture to the test. Maybe a Gaul, or even a Briton, waits for Glaucon to stop linging. What's so funny, Glaucon? Why don't you just denounce me as a son of Hades and be done with it? I have no wish to denounce anyone. I'm merely puzzled. Then I return to my original claim. Compared to Athenian greatness, the barbarians' paltry accomplishments make me laugh. Then I return to my original critique. If we're going to laugh at anyone, it is not barbarians, but the mass of unaccomplished human beings, barbarian and Athenian alike. Points at Socrates, arrogant son of Hades. Socrates, I said, if we're going to laugh at anyone to make a deeper point. Namely, Socrates, great thinkers, rather than laughing at the common man, should acknowledge his value. Civilization is not the product of knowledge alone. It is a partnership of knowledge and effort. Yes, great thinkers bring most of the knowledge, but the common man provides most of the effort, and neither is worth much without the other, my dear Glaucon. You would deprive the common Athenian of his pride, no more than you would deprive the barbarian of his. Well, if Athenian greatness is a lie, at least it is a noble lie. Could you not say the same about the festival of barbaric thought? To be honest, I share your disapproval. People should stop seeking solace in the accomplishments of strangers. Including me, I suppose? Yes, I suppose so. Then what's left? Socrates, instead of spreading allegedly noble lies about Athenians or barbarians, my dear Glaucon, let us spread the noble truth that civilization is the product of human knowledge and human effort, and celebrate both wherever they may be found. April 4th, 2018. They were terrible. Suppose you identify with a large unselective group, a nationality, religion, ethnicity, political party, etc. An historian comes along and shows that this group once committed a monstrous atrocity, say mass murder. This leaves you with 4 options. 1. To keep your identity and share the blame. We were terrible. 2. To renounce your identity and avoid the blame. They were terrible. 3. To redefine the perpetrator's identity and avoid the blame. We weren't involved. 4. To keep your identity and deny the facts. Never happened, and they had it coming. If you value your identity, the first 2 options are bitter. The third option's only slightly more palatable because it makes group membership contingent on good behavior rather than a birthright. No wonder, then, that humans gravitate toward the 4th option. Intellectually, of course, denial's unconvincing. When outgroups evade ugly truths, we readily detect their dishonesty. But when you deny, fellow group members will back you up. If you're sufficiently clannish, or if your group is very common, you'll rarely be called to account for your childishness. What alternative is there? As I've argued before, you simply shouldn't identify with large unselective groups. Truth matters more than any tribe. And if you've followed this advice, you can interpret history honestly without bruising your ego. Americans, Catholics, Irish, or Democrats committed grave wrongs? Then they were terrible. It's got nothing to do with me. July 4th, 2017. Dear Nationalism. Dear Nationalism, we've grown up together. In a sense, you and I have been together our whole lives. In a deeper sense, though, we've never been together. I've tried to let you down easy 100 times. But subtlety doesn't work on you, Nationalism. I don't want to hurt you. But Nationalism, you're constantly hurting me. The only way to protect myself, I'm afraid, is to tell you how I feel, loud and clear. I know that I was born inside your national borders. But I don't love you, Nationalism. I don't even like you. I don't want patriotic solidarity with you. I want you to leave me alone. Stop acting like you own me. Stop calling me. I don't want to be with you. The mere fact that I haven't fled the country doesn't turn my no into a yes. Do you know what you're like, Nationalism? You're like medieval religion. In the bad old days, authorities assigned people a religion and effectively forbade them quit. Sometimes quitting was itself a crime. In other cases, religion expelled its exes from the country. The common theme, religion didn't take no for an answer. In hindsight, the past abusiveness of religion is plain. But you're no better, Nationalism. Violation is a way of life for you. You're as unwilling to take no for an answer as the intolerant religion of yesteryear. Nationalism, I know you're itching to lecture me about how you're better than all the other nationalisms out there. That may be true, but it's no excuse for the way you treat me. Stop talking like you own the house I live in, the air I breathe, or me. You don't. You never did. Frankly, Nationalism, you make my flesh crawl. Am I cruel? No crueler than I have to be to make my wishes known. There are plenty of fish in the sea, Nationalism. Lots of them love you already. Go have patriotic solidarity with them. Just leave me out of it. Goodbye. May 29th, 2014. The world is wrong. Crusades and you. Every 5 years or so, the United States has a major societal-wide crusade. Sometimes there's a shocking event. Other times there's an ongoing evil. Either way, all Americans are supposed to join forces and take decisive action to win the crusade. And even if you can't personally do anything, you're supposed to get very angry. You're supposed to be very angry about the problem. You're supposed to be very angry about anyone who stands between us and victory. You're supposed to angrily support our crusaders. You're supposed to be very angry about people who aren't very angry. Here is a list of all the full-blown crusades I personally recall in chronological order. Yes, there's a line drawing problem, so if you think I've missed one, please share in the comments. 1. Islamist Iran. When Iranian students took American embassy workers hostage, even kids under 10 were angry. Something had to be done. When the hostage rescue mission failed, my parents broke their no TV at dinner rule because they needed to know what happened. A popular t-shirt actually read, "Vote yes for Lake Iran." 2. The war on drugs. Beginning in the 70s and throughout the 80s, my schools were covered in anti-drug propaganda. So were billboards all over LA. Everyone was supposed to be vigilantly searching for drug dealers offering free samples of hard drugs in suburban elementary schools. My high school hired Dave Toma to preside over an apocalyptic anti-drug revival meeting for the whole school. 3. Free Kuwait. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, American society flipped out again. Back then, I doubt most Americans knew the difference between Iraq and Iran, but they were still enraged. If you opposed action, the knee-jerk question was, well, what do you propose to do? Even most anti-war activists would glumly respond, give sanctions time to work. When I stopped by my old high school, my history teacher had a Free Kuwait bumper sticker on his podium. 4. The War on Terror. The aftermath of the dissolution of Yugoslavia never attained crusade status, though the Kosovo War came close. How many times did I hear contemporary media use the phrase ethnic Albanian Kosovars? 9/11, however, launched the biggest crusade of my lifetime. Flags and stickers and bloodthirsty opinions were everywhere. My dad was visiting me when the U.S. started bombing Afghanistan. My mom phoned him to let him know the U.S. attack had begun, and he gushed, "It's about time." 5. The Iraq War. Almost everyone vocally supported the destruction of the Taliban. The crusade to unseat Saddam Hussein, in contrast, sparked mild domestic resistance and massive domestic counter-resistance. The Congressional War Authorization vote won by more than 2-1. The Dixie Chicks got canceled before getting canceled was a thing. 6. The 2008 financial crisis. TARP was controversial, but primarily because so many people wanted to bail out Main Street as well as Wall Street. Other than Scott Sumner, almost no one wanted to hear about simple technocratic fixes like nominal GDP targeting. 7. COVID. I don't count opposition to Trump or Brexit as a crusade because public opinion was always sharply divided. The COVID crusade, in contrast, went from a minor issue in late February 2020 to the end of the world by April. And while it may seem like there's been debate, it is the hysterical consensus that stands out. All 50 states declared a state of emergency. And even today, I'm vaccinated, so I should be exempt from these rules, remains a heretical position. Not to be confused with the mainstream position that the CDC now says vaccinated people are allowed to do X. 8. Black Lives Matter. Until George Floyd, this was just one popular issue out of many. Now, almost a year later, I continue to encounter heavy-handed anti-racist propaganda and bizarre expiation attempts. The police publicly murder an innocent man, so all of the black characters on The Simpsons have to be voiced by black actors? In Derek's fall, we sinned all. When I classify X as a crusade, this obviously doesn't mean that the events that sparked the crusade didn't happen, nor does it mean that the events weren't bad. What it means, rather, is that the public reaction was highly emotional and hence deeply unreliable. Once a crusade is underway, you can no longer ask pertinent questions like, how bad is this event on a to 10 scale, where 10 is the extinction of humanity? Or what are the odds that our efforts will make things worse? Or are we mistreating bystanders? And a fundamental principle of effective altruism is that you should always ask such questions. Now, I wish I could say that I've opposed every single one of these crusades, but that's not true. Alas, I was an earnest drug warrior as a child. Indeed, I favored summary execution for even the smallest drug offense, which freaked out some of the adults in my life, though I never freaked out an adult enough to make them admit, well, drugs are bad, but they're not summary execution bad. Still, I saw the error of my ways before I turned 18. I realized I was dead wrong about the war on drugs, and I've had the sense to spurn each and every subsequent crusade. Verily, you will not stampede me. How popular are these crusades really? On reflection, most Americans probably support all the crusades unleashed during their adult lives. After the fervor dies down, they may feel occasional regret, but selective amnesia is far more prevalent, and it's hard not to look down on such sheeple. Yet shouldn't we be equally critical of folks like me who oppose every crusade that comes along? You might even, quote, inherit the wind, which ends by hinting that cynics are even worse than fanatics. I'm getting damn tired of you, Hornbeck. Why? You never pushed a noun against a verb except to blow something up. That's a typical lawyer's trick, accusing the accuser. What am I accused of? I charge you with contempt of conscience, self-perjury, kindness aforethought, sentimentality in the first degree. Why? Because I refuse to erase a man's lifetime. I tell you, Brady had the same right as Cates, the right to be wrong. My answer: in a world where opinion leaders take effective altruism to heart, we should indeed look down on those who stubbornly refuse to support well-vetted, self-aware causes. But since the real world is ruled by hysteria and hurting, there is a strong built-in presumption that any crusade popular enough to get off the ground is unworthy of your support. And since most of us, thankfully, only live through a dozen or so crusades per lifetime, you shouldn't be surprised if exactly 0 of them surmount that presumption. May 19th, 2021. The Risks of Friendship, a Socratic Dialogue. The scene, ancient Athens. Glaucon is standing in the Parthenon, wearing a face mask. Socrates enters with his face fully visible. Greetings, Glaucon. How fare you during this awful plague? What the hell are you doing? Are you trying to kill me? No, why would you think so? We're indoors, and you're not wearing your mask. I'm 20 feet away from you, and the Parthenon is cavernous. You should be wearing a mask. Very well. Feel safe enough to talk now? I suggest we go outside to continue the conversation with greater ease. 1 minute later, outside the Parthenon, Socrates and Glaucon are 25 feet apart. I must admit, Glaucon, I'm very puzzled. About what? About your level of fear. Oh, I'm not afraid. Well, what do you think are the odds that I've got the plague right now? 1 in 1,000. Socrates, reasonable enough. I'm asymptomatic after all. Now, supposing I was sick, what are the odds that I would have infected you within the Parthenon while wearing a mask? 1 in 20? Plausibly. And what are the odds I would have infected you in the same scenario without wearing a mask? 1 in 5? Very well. Now, as we both know, susceptibility to the plague depends heavily on age and underlying conditions. We're both 50. Do you have any underlying conditions? Thankfully, no. Then, according to a table Plato compiled for me, your odds of death if infected are about 1 in 2,000. It's not just about the risk of death, Socrates. Socrates, it never is. There is also the unpleasantness of the plague's symptoms and a small chance of long-run harm. Still, the same goes for all risks. Those who survive a fall from a horse usually suffer pain for a week or two, and a small fraction are maimed for life. So we can still fruitfully compare your risk of death from plague to other mortality risks, never losing sight of the fact that death is only one of many possible tragic outcomes. Fine. Very well. Let us calculate the risk I imposed on you earlier by not wearing a mask. We multiply my risk of infection times the change in your infection risk times your mortality risk. That comes to 1 in 1,000, 10.2.005, 1/2,000, which rounds to about 1 in 13 million. And that seems small to you. Wouldn't it seem small to any sober man? Well, is it really so awful to wear a mask? Socrates, I wouldn't mind if the numbers were more favorable. If I were endangering 1,000 people like you, I'd happily wear a mask. As it stands, though, your fear seems paranoid and your outrage seems unjust. Look, why should I have to endure any risk for your comfort? You're enduring a risk right now. Surely you don't imagine that your infection risk magically falls to zero as soon as you exit the Parthenon. Well, why should I have to endure an unnecessary risk? Socrates, it is necessary that we speak at all? Hardly, and we could slash our risk further by separating 100 feet and shouting at each other. Now you're just being difficult. I only wish to understand you, Glaucon. Is that your horse over there? Yes, Pegasus is his name. A noble moniker. Now, do you know the annual risk of dying on horseback? About 1 in 10,000. Indeed. Yet you've never fretted over the risk of death by horse? The daily risk is 1/3 65th of the annual risk. Or hadn't you considered that? Quite right. The daily risk of death by horse is therefore about 1 in 4 million, more than 3 times the risk that terrified you inside the Parthenon. As long as I'm alone, I'm not exposed to any risk of plague at all. And as long as you're unhorsed, you're not exposed to any risk of death on horseback. Yet during the minutes you're on horseback, you're a model of composure. Why then are you so fearful of plague? Plague is contagious. Death on horseback is not. Socrates, I've seen you riding with your son, slightly endangering his life as well as your own. That's not precisely contagion, but you can hardly claim that you're endangering no one but yourself when you ride Pegasus. If I catch plague, though, I could be responsible for the deaths of thousands. Socrates, possible, I'll grant. If you were returning home from a plague-infested land, I'd understand your scruples. You wouldn't want to be the conduit for mass destruction. Indeed not. Socrates, by now, however, this plague is already well advanced. You're highly unlikely to make it noticeably worse. Indeed, by this point, the average person infects less than 1 extra person. I might not be average. Socrates, you are right to say so. Still, shouldn't our knowledge of averages guide our behavior? In any case, let us return to the key issue. Why are you so fearful of talking inside the Parthenon without masks when the risk of death is vanishingly low? Perhaps we should sponsor a raging bacchanalia then. I think not. A drunken festival of 100 people would probably have 1,000 times the plague risk of a 2-person conversation. We should avoid that until the plague subsides. So you admit the danger? I always did. I'm not saying that plague is harmless. I'm saying that you're reacting to risk qualitatively rather than quantitatively. Meaning, you're much more afraid of a tiny plague risk than a larger horseback risk. Why do you think that is? Have you ever seen someone die of plague? Socrates, have you ever seen someone die on horseback? Both are terrible tragedies, with a long list of ugly secondary risks. Look, you're in denial. Everyone in Athens is scared of the plague. Your risk analysis is beside the point. How can risk analysis ever be beside the point? We as a society have decided to fight the plague, and you're going to have to do your part, like it or not. Glaucon, what is my profession? What? I said, Glaucon, what is my profession? You're a philosopher. Indeed, as a philosopher, what is my mission? To defy and aggravate others? Hardly. As a philosopher, my mission is to improve the thinking of my fellow Athenians, my fellow Greeks, my fellow human beings. Very noble. I take a certain pride in my efforts. How, though, am I supposed to improve their thinking? I don't know. The answer seemingly is by asking questions. Yes, yes. Now, Glaucon, when you urge me to do my part, what do you have in mind? Wear the mask, Socrates. I'm wearing one now to put you at ease while we converse. In more crowded conditions, I've worn a mask out of prudence and decency. But as a philosopher, obediently wearing a mask is woefully inadequate. Well, what more should we do? Socrates, I don't know about non-philosophers. For we philosophers to do our part, however, requires us to challenge popular fallacies and innumeracy. Isn't this just an elaborate rationalization for putting your needs above the lives of your fellow Athenians? Socrates, possibly. More likely, though, your agitation is an elaborate rationalization for putting conformity above reason. Your numbers could be wrong, you know? Indeed, I suspect that all of my numbers are wrong. As we learn more, each of my numbers will be revised. If you don't really know the risks, why are you lecturing me? Because, Glaucon, you're approaching the uncertainty emotionally rather than analytically. Uncertainty is a poor argument for panic. I was never panicked. Very well, let us take off these masks, re-enter the Parthenon, and continue the conversation in comfort. The midday sun is too much for me. Are you crazy, Socrates? And a corrupter of the youth, from what I hear. Do you think there will be a trial? Look who's panicking now. A fair point, my dear Glaucon, a fair point. Look, Socrates, it all comes down to this. There's no reason not to just go along with society's expectations here. No reason. What about friendship? I don't follow you, Socrates. Since this plague struck, I've barely seen you. Mask or no mask, you avoid me, as you avoid almost all human contact. Well, what do you expect me to do? Socrates, weigh the tiny risks to health against the immense value of friendship. You're making too much of this, Socrates. Socrates, am I? The great Epicurus taught us that friendship is one of the highest of goods. Friendship is essential to human happiness and a life well lived. You speak unjustly to me, Socrates. I am and ever have been your friend. I know, which is why your panic pains me so. If you're really my friend, you will share my concern for my own safety. I do, Glaucon. If you were in serious danger and I could save you by shunning you, I would grieve. Yet shun you I would. Very gracious of you. I know you would do the same for me. Again, most gracious. The plain fact, however, is that you are not in serious danger. By the numbers, you are in the kind of minor danger that you've always accepted in the past. And so I say the time is long since past to resume our normal, friendly relations. In troubled times, minor adjustments are often wise. But abandoning your friends out of fear of minor risks is folly, Glaucon. Well, thank you for your candor, Socrates. May we meet again in saner times, my friend. Good day to you, Socrates. Good day. Glaucon and Socrates go their separate ways. September 8th, 2020. What I'm thinking. 1. Getting people to be rational about politics is an uphill battle during the best of times. During a global hysteria, it's hopeless. 2. Due to this doleful realization, I refrained from discussing the lockdown when it first emerged. The best course, I deemed, was to wait for readers to simmer down. 3. Since many have now simmered down, here's what I was thinking 3 months ago. 4. I was convinced that coronavirus was a dire threat by early March, but I opposed the lockdown from day one. 5. Why? Because per Humer's The Problem of Political Authority, I accept a strong presumption in favor of human liberty. You cannot rightfully shut businesses and order people to stay at home out of an abundance of caution. Instead, the burden is on the advocates of these policies to demonstrate that their benefits drastically exceed their costs by at least 5-1. Almost no one even tried to discharge this burden. 6. Telling people to err on the side of caution is a recipe for severe oppression. Individuals, in contrast, have every right to personally err on the side of caution. In early weeks of the crisis, when risk information was scarce, erring on the side of caution was reasonable. 7. Nevertheless, I was initially moderately optimistic that lockdown policies would, in hindsight, at least pass an ordinary cost-benefit test. I no longer think so. Even draconian measures have mostly failed to put R0 far below 1. 8. Due to the absence of paid voluntary human experimentation, we still lack definitive answers to almost every crucial coronavirus question. Over the last 2 months, though, I have raised my best estimate of the infection fatality rate from 0.3% to 0.6%. 9. During the same time, initial claims about the age and especially the pre-existing health status gradient of mortality have been confirmed even more strongly than I expected. Near zero people, known to have no underlying conditions, have died of coronavirus. There is a middle category of underlying conditions unknown with fairly high mortality. I wish we knew more about such people. But my best guess is that 90% have underlying conditions, versus about 40% for the general population. 10. Roughly 5% of survivors seem to have long-run problems, but risk of serious long-run problems almost certainly correlates with risk of death. And of course, a wide variety of other risks, like car accidents, commonly maim survivors. Coronavirus is not remotely a sui generis package of dangers. 11. Am I saying that I don't care if old and sick people die? No, but I confess that I would care even more if young and healthy people died. I know this sounds terrible, but my view is not eccentric. It's implied by the standard notion of Keeley's, and almost everyone I surveyed agrees with me. 12. Coley's aside, the extreme heterogeneity of risk highlights a cheap, humane alternative to the status quo. Healthy people should return to approximately normal life, while people with underlying ailments should maintain elevated to extreme caution. 13. Why approximately normal rather than fully normal? Because healthy people should make reasonable efforts to protect vulnerable people. This obligation should be legally enforceable in extreme cases, like deliberately coughing on others. Otherwise, we should trust to conscience and social pressure. 14. Why elevated to extreme caution? Because though the data on underlying conditions is binary, the actual severity of conditions like diabetes varies widely. 15. Following this dual path would get us to herd immunity with few deaths, especially when combined with multiple other layers of reasonable precaution. Hopefully, I'm wrong, but waiting around for a vaccine seems like wishful thinking. Nor should we forget that unemployment is a grave evil. 16. What's my risk of death is infected? Being a 49-year-old gives me roughly the average risk. Being white and male roughly cancel. Since I have no underlying conditions, I estimate my risk at about 5.4% of the base risk of 0.6%. That comes to about 1 in 3,000. That's about 3 times my annual risk of dying in an auto accident. That gives me pause. I've long told my kids that driving is the most dangerous thing we do. When choosing my behavior, however, I have to remember that I might still contract the disease despite exercising extreme caution, and I might avoid the disease despite exercising merely reasonable caution. I'd put the former probability at about 15% and the latter probability at about 40%. So the marginal risk of hewing to reasonable versus extreme caution is only 1 in 12,000. Driving, moreover, imposes roughly equal risks on all my family members. Coronavirus, in contrast, poses near zero risk to my children. 18. The U.S. has ample state capacity to follow the advice of a few reasonable economists. But no wise policies will be adopted because we have bipartisan dysfunctional state priorities. You might think a crisis would bring demagoguery under control. Alas, it hasn't, and it won't. 19. Alex Tabarrok is wrong to state social distancing, closing non-essential firms, and working from home protect the vulnerable, but these same practices protect workers in critical industries. Thus, the debate between protecting the vulnerable and protecting the economy is moot. Moot? True, there is a mild trade-off between protecting vulnerable and protecting the economy. But if we didn't care about the vulnerable at all, the disease would have already run its course, and economic life would already have strongly rebounded. Wouldn't self-protection have stymied this? Not if the government hadn't expanded unemployment coverage and benefits, because most people don't save enough money to quit their jobs for a couple of months. With most of the workforce still on the job, fast, exponential growth would have given us herd immunity long ago. The death toll would have been several times higher. But that's the essence of the trade-off between protecting the vulnerable and protecting the economy. June 1st, 2020. What I'm doing. 1. The U.S. political system is deeply dysfunctional, especially during this crisis. Power hunger reigns in the name of social desirability bias. Fear of punishment aside, I don't care what authorities say. They should heed my words, not the other way around. 2. Few private individuals are using quantitative risk analysis to guide their personal behavior. Fear of antagonizing such people aside, I don't care what they say either. 3. I am extremely interested in listening to the rare individuals who do use quantitative risk analysis to guide personal behavior. Keep up the good work, Life Coach Quants, with a special shout out to Rob Wiblin. 4. After listening, though, I shall keep my own counsel. As long as I maintain my normal intellectual hygiene, my betting record shows that my own counsel is highly reliable. 5. What does my own counsel say? While I wish better information were available, I now know enough to justify my return to 90% normal life. The rest of my immediate family agrees. What does this entail? Above all, I am now happy to socialize in person with friends. I am happy to let my children play with other kids. I am also willing to not only eat takeout food, but dine in restaurants. I am pleased to accommodate nervous friends by socializing outdoors and otherwise putting them at ease. Yet personally, I am at ease either way. 6. I will still take precautions comparable to wearing a seatbelt. I will wear a mask and gloves to shop in high-traffic places, such as grocery stores. I will continue to keep my distance from nervous and/or high-risk strangers. CAPLAN 2020 will be delayed until winter at the earliest. Alas. 7. Tyler suggests that people like me are worse at intertemporal substitution than I had thought. In particular, it either will continue at that pace or it won't. Let's say that pace continues. Unlikely in my view, but this is simply a scenario, at least until the second wave. That is an ongoing risk higher than other causes of death, unless you are young. You don't have to be 77 for it to be your major risk worry. Death from coronavirus is plausibly my single highest worry, but it is still only a tiny share of my total risk, and the cost of strict risk reduction is high for me. Avoiding everyone except my immediate family makes my everyday much worse. An intertemporal substitution is barely helpful. Doubling my level of socializing in 2022 to compensate for severe isolation in 2020 won't make me feel better. Alternatively, let's say the pace of those deaths will fall soon, and furthermore, let's say it will fall by a lot. The near future will be a lot safer, which is all the more reason to play it very safe right now, because your per-week risk is currently fairly high in many, not all parts of America. Stay at home and wear a mask when you do go out. If need be, make up for that behavior in the near future by indulging in excess. Suppose Tyler found out that an accident-free car were coming in 2022. Would he intertemporally substitute by ceasing driving until then? I doubt it. In any case, what I really expect is at least 6 more months of moderately elevated risk. My risk is far from awful now. My best guess is that I'm choosing a 1 in 12,000 marginal increase in the risk of death from coronavirus. But this risk won't fall below 1 in 50,000 during the next 6 months, and moderate second waves are likely. Bottom line, the risk is mild enough for me to comfortably face and too durable for me to comfortably avoid. 8. The risk analysis is radically different for people with underlying health conditions. Many of them are my friends. To such friends, I fully support your decision to avoid me, but I am happy to flexibly accommodate you if you too detest the isolation. I also urge you to reduce your personal risk, but it's not my place to nag you to your face. 9. What about high-risk strangers? I'm happy to take reasonable measures to reduce their risk. If you're wearing a mask, I treat that as a request for extra distance, and I honor it. But I'm not going to isolate myself out of fear of infecting high-risk people who won't isolate themselves. 10. Most smart people aren't doing what I'm doing. Shouldn't I be worried? Only slightly. Even smart people are prone to herding and hysteria. I've now spent 3 months listening to smart defenders of the conventional view. Their herding and hysteria are hard to miss. Granted, non-smart contrarians sound even worse, but smart contrarians make the most sense of all. 11. Even if I'm right, wouldn't it be more prudent for me to act on my beliefs without publicizing them? That's probably what Dale Carnegie would advise, but if Dale were here, I'd tell him, candor on touchy topics is my calling and my business. It's worked well for me so far, and I shall stay the course. 12. I've long believed a strong version of A, buy and hold, is the best investment strategy, and B, financial market performance is only vaguely related to objective economic conditions. Conditions in March were so bleak that I set aside both of these beliefs and moved from 100% stocks to 90% bonds. As a result of my excessive open-mindedness, my family has lost an enormous amount of money. The situation is so weird that I'm going to wait until January to return to my normal investment strategy. After that, I will never again deviate from buy and hold. Never. June 2nd, 2020. Life years lost, the quantity and the quality. A few weeks ago, the NYT reported that the coronavirus has claimed 2.5 million years of potential life. If you read the original study, you'll discover one crucial caveat. The author's calculations assume that COVID victims would have the standard life expectancy for Americans of their age. They freely admit that this is unrealistic and inflates their estimate. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is known to infect and replicate in many different tissues and exacerbates problems in several organ systems, including the kidney, liver, heart, lungs, and brain. Any individual with problems in these systems or the immune system is likely to be more vulnerable to SARS-CoV-2 infection and suffer more severe outcomes, as has been demonstrated for immune deficiencies. In addition, other health states qualifying as pre-existing conditions, such as obesity, hypertension, chronic kidney disease, and diabetes, are known comorbidity factors for COVID-19, and these cohorts of individuals have a shorter than average predicted lifespan. Deaths due to complications with pre-existing conditions would artificially increase the person years lost in these calculations, but are difficult to quantitate in this current analysis. The authors argue that fixing this problem would only modestly cut their estimates. I'm not convinced, but I'd rather focus on a much bigger issue, taking quality of life into account. How many life years has the reaction to COVID destroyed? To see what I'm getting at, ask yourself, suppose you could either live a year of life in the COVID era or X months under normal conditions. What's the value of X? Given the enormous social disruption and dire social isolation that most people have endured, X equals 10 months seems like a conservative estimate. For what it's worth, this Twitter poll agrees. You could object that my Twitter followers are self-selected to regard COVID prevention costs as high. In point of fact, they consider the personal costs markedly less serious than the average costs. So what? Well, we've now endured 8 months of COVID life. If that's worth only 5/6 as much as normal time, the average American has now lost 4/3 of a month. Multiplying that by the total American population of 330 million, the total loss comes to about 37 million years of life. That's about 15 times the reported estimate of the direct cost of COVID. Casual readers will be tempted to declare that the cure has been much worse than the disease. The right cost-benefit comparison, however, is not to weigh the cost of prevention against the harm endured. The right cost-benefit comparison is to weigh the cost of prevention against the harm prevented. You have to ask yourself, if normal life had continued unabated since March, how many additional life years would have been lost? I can believe that the number would have been double what we observed, even though no country on earth has done so poorly. With effort, I can imagine that the number would have been triple what we observed. There's a tiny chance it could have been 5 times worse, but 15 times? No way. Upshot, the total cost of all COVID prevention has very likely exceeded the total benefit of all COVID prevention. Before you panic, note these key caveats. 1. This does not imply that zero COVID prevention was optimal. The lesson is merely that we went much too far. 2. Prevention includes both private and government efforts. The main lesson of the data is not merely that government overreacted, but that people overreacted. 3. As I've argued before, the initial costs of government action were moderate because private individuals reacted strongly on their own. Over time, however, government's share of the burden has increased because private individuals have a strong tendency to lose patience and return to normalcy. If a vaccine suddenly becomes available today, my calculations for the story so far would still hold. Behavioral changes prevent deaths day by day. They also drain life of much of its meaning day to day. At this point, you could protest, "Hey Bryan, I thought you weren't a utilitarian." So what if the cost of COVID prevention greatly exceeds the value of life saved? My answer, to repeat, is that I have a strong moral presumption in favor of human liberty. So while I respect individuals' rights to overreact to moderate risks, I oppose any act of government that does not pass a cost-benefit test with flying colors. And no, I don't think that an asymptomatic person who walks down the street unmasked is aggressing against passersby in any meaningful way. November 24th, 2020. An ageless hypothetical. Suppose you could either save one 10-year-old or X 80-year-olds. What value of X is morally indifferent? That is, if you wanted to make the world as morally valuable as possible, when should you switch from saving one youth to X elders? I suspect that people's modal answer will be 1, not the median, and certainly not the mean, but probably the mode. Why would X equals 1 be such a popular answer? Charitably, people said X equals 1 because they sincerely believe that all lives have equal value. In all honesty, though, I've yet to meet a person who merits this charity. No one responds to the deaths of 10-year-olds and 80-year-olds with remotely equal concern. Setting X equals 1 is one of the clearest cut example of social desirability bias I've encountered. The lives of the young are plainly much more valuable than the lives of the old, for 3 reasons. 1. When the young die, they lose far more years of life. 2. When the young die, they are far more likely to lose healthy years of life. 3. When the young die, the people who survive them miss them much more, and miss them for a much longer time. All things considered, I'd say that a reasonable value of X is at least 100, probably more like 1,000. I suspect that many readers will strongly object to this, but on what basis? Point 1 is clearly a big deal. A 10-year-old can be expected to live another 69 years, an 80-year-old just 9 more years. Point 2 is also clearly important. Self-reported health dramatically declines with age, and people clearly grade their health on an age-based curve. An 80-year-old's version of good health is probably what an 18-year-old calls poor health. What about point 3? Despite angry denials, this disparity is enormous, just as Darwin would predict. The loss of a child is devastating. Many parents who lose a child never emotionally recover. In contrast, most people get over the loss of an elderly parent in weeks or days. Indeed, to be brutally honest, a notable minority of people actually feel better when an elderly parent dies. Never mind ungrateful children slobbering for their inheritances. A model child can still be relieved by the death of a parent living in pain, no longer able to enjoy life, or a parent whose dementia has robbed them of their sense of self. Why are people so reluctant to admit these truisms? In part, because they fear the bodyguards of social desirability bias. Once you admit the obvious fact that the lives of the elderly are worth much less than the lives of the young, they'll absurdly claim you favor murdering the elderly. Once you admit the obvious fact that people miss the elderly less than the young, they'll absurdly claim that you don't care if anyone over 50 drops dead. Whatever. A strict consequentialist will draw no fundamental killing and letting die. The rest of us, however, know that it is wrong to murder the miserable, but praiseworthy to get the miserable, but praiseworthy to get the most bang for your buck when you're selecting charities or spending taxpayer money. Another reason people are so reluctant to admit that the lives of the young are worth far more than the lives of the old, though, is pride. I just turned 50. Does this mean my life is worth much less than it did when I was 20? Hemming and hawing aside, the honest answer is yes. I've burned up at least 75% of the value of my life already. While I plan to savor my last 25%, do me a favor. If you ever have to choose between saving me and saving one of my children, save them. Indeed, if you ever have to choose between saving me for sure and saving one of my children with 10% probability, save them. April 13th, 2021. Tuskegee versus COVID. When bioethicists want to justify their own existence, they routinely point to the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. It's a gripping story. Back in 1932, the the U.S. Public Health Service started a study of 399 black men with latent syphilis, plus a control group of 201 black men without syphilis. Contrary to what I've sometimes heard, the researchers never injected anyone with syphilis. However, they grossly violated the principle of informed consent, with disastrous consequences. As an incentive for participation in the study, the men were promised free medical care, but were deceived by the PHS, who never informed subjects of their diagnosis and disguised placebos, ineffective methods, and diagnostic procedures as treatment. The men were initially told that the study was only going to last 6 months, but it was extended to 40 years. After funding for treatment was lost, the study was continued without informing the men that they would never be treated. None of the infected men were treated with penicillin, despite the fact that by 1947 the antibiotic was widely available and had become the standard treatment for syphilis. Why do bioethicists habitually invoke the Tuskegee experiment to justify current human subjects review? Which is bizarre, because human subjects review applies to a vast range of obviously innocuous activities. Under current rules, you need approval from human subjects merely to conduct a survey, i.e., to talk to a bunch of people and record their answers. The rationale, presumably, is you should only conduct research on human beings if they give you informed consent. And we shouldn't let researchers decide for themselves if informed consent has been given. Only bioethicists and their well-trained minions can make that call. On reflection, this just pushes the issue back a step. Researchers aren't allowed to decide if their human experiment requires informed consent. However, they are allowed to decide if what they're doing counts as an experiment. No one submits a formal request to their Human Subjects Review Board before emailing other researchers questions about their work. No professor submits a formal request to their Human Subjects Review Board before polling his students. Why not? Because they don't classify such activities as experiments. How is a formal survey any more experimental than emailing researchers or polling students? To quote the prisoner, questions are a burden to others, answers a prison for oneself. The safest answer for bioethicists, of course, is simply, they should get our approval for those activities too. The more territory bioethicists claim for themselves, however, the more you have to wonder, how good is bioethicists' moral judgment in the first place? To answer this question, let me bring up a bioethical incident thousands of times deadlier than the Tuskegee experiment. You see, there was a deadly plague called COVID-19. Researchers quickly came up with promising vaccines. They could have tested the safety and efficacy of these vaccines in about 1 month using voluntary paid human experimentation. How? Step 1. Vaccinate half the volunteers and give the other half a placebo. Step 2. Wait a week, then inject all the volunteers with COVID-19. Alternately, give half of each subgroup a placebo injection. Step 3. Compare the COVID infection rates of the vaccinated and unvaccinated 2 to 4 weeks later. In the real world, researchers only did step 1, then waited about 6 months to compare naturally occurring infection rates. During this period, ignorance of the various vaccines' efficacy continued. Almost no one received any COVID vaccine, and over 1 million people died. In the end, researchers discovered that the vaccines were highly effective, so this delay really did cause mass death. How come no country on Earth tried voluntary paid human experimentation? At least as I'm writing, maybe this will have started by the time you read this. As far as I can tell, the most important factor was the formal and informal opposition of bioethicists. In particular, bioethicists converged on absurdly or impossibly high standards for truly informed consent to deliberate infection. Here's a prime example. An important principle in human challenge studies is that subjects must give their informed consent in order to take part. That means they should be provided with all the relevant information about the risk they are considering. But that is impossible for such a new disease. Why can't you bluntly tell would-be subjects, this is a very new disease, so there could be all sorts of unforeseen complications. Do you still consent? Because the real point of bioethics isn't to ensure informed consent, but to veto informed consent to whatever gives bioethicists the willies. I'm no paternalist, but I understand paternalism. Paternalists want to stop people from harming themselves. The goal of bioethicists, however, is far stranger. Bioethicists want to stop people from helping others. Even if experimental subjects heroically volunteer to be injected for no money at all, bioethicists stand on guard to overrule them. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Bioethics is to ethics as astrology is to astronomy. If bioethicists had previously prevented 100 Tuskegees from happening, COVID would still have turned the existence of their entire profession into a net negative for humanity. Verily, we would be better off if their field had never existed. If you find this hard to believe, remember, what the Tuskegee researchers did was already illegal in 1932. Instead of creating a pile of new rules enforced by a cult of sanctimonious busybodies, the obvious response was to apply the familiar laws of contract and fiduciary duty. These rules alone would have sent people like the Tuskegee researchers to jail where they belong. And they would have left forthright practitioners of voluntary paid human experimentation free to do their vital life-saving work. In a just world, future generations would hear stories of the monstrous effort to impede COVID-19 vaccine research. Textbooks and documentaries would icily describe bioethicists' lame rationalizations for allowing over 1 million people to die. If the Tuskegee experiments laid the groundwork for modern human subjects review, the COVID non-experiments would lay the groundwork for the abolition of these deadly shackles on medical progress. Which is further proof, in case you needed any, that we don't live in a just world. February 16th, 2021. Free will and behavioral genetics. Behavioral geneticists, BGs, don't like to be called genetic determinists. No, they protest. All we've shown is that genes exert some influence. Twin and adoption studies show that environment is important too. But what would they say if you replied, okay, so you're a genetic plus environmental determinist, same difference? Most BGs would probably reluctantly accept the charge. After all, what else is there besides genes and environment? If you take a closer look at BG research, though, you'll notice something interesting. Virtually every BG study partitions variance into 3 sources: genes, shared family environment, and non-shared environment. Typical estimates are something like 40 to 50% for genes, 0-10% for shared family environment, and 50% for non-shared environment. And what exactly is non-shared environment? Everything other than genes and family environment. Why do I bring this all up? Well, suppose human beings had real, honest-to-goodness free will. If it made a difference for behavior, where would it show itself? In the BG framework, it would be filed under non-shared environment. Okay, now let's get Bayesian. If you could fully account for a person's choices using genetics and measurable environmental variables, you'd count it as a confirmation of determinism, right? Well, if you buy this argument, you also have to buy its mirror image. The harder it is to account for a person's choices using genetics and measurable environmental variables, the stronger the case for free will. From this perspective, the large empirical estimates of the importance of non-shared environment are noteworthy. Identical twins raised together are still, in many ways, very different. The believer in free will can simply say, the good twin and the evil twin just made different choices. The determinist, in contrast, can only ask for a blank check. One day, we'll figure out the hidden forces that cause them to be so different. Until then, bear with us. Let me hasten to add that the magnitude of non-shared environment in BG research is not the main reason why I believe in free will. In my view, free will is fundamentally a modal claim, not a predictive one. You can know with overwhelming certainty that I won't shave my head tomorrow. It doesn't change the fact that I could shave my head tomorrow. And the main reason why I believe in free will is introspection, not any fancy argument. Nevertheless, I strongly suspect that if non-shared environment's contribution to behavioral variance were a lot smaller, determinists would be heralding the result as proof of their position. And if this suspicion is right, it's only fair to ask them to reduce their confidence in light of the findings of BG research. April 20th, 2009. Conservative relativism. I spent a lot of time conversing with conservative intellectuals this week. What surprised me most was their moral relativism. Sure, they spent a lot of time griping about left-wing relativism. The awful liberals refuse to admit the West is morally superior to Islamic and other non-Western cultures, or the United States is morally superior to Europe's decadent social democracies. But the conservatives were also quick to dismiss claims about Western and American moral failings. The U.S. immigration laws of the 1920s were explicitly driven by Nordic racism, too. Let's not flagellate ourselves. That was fixed long ago. The genocide of the Indians? That was the price of civilization. George Washington, father of our country, was a slaver? Well, it was common at the time. The West's murderous crusades? Whatever. The conservatives could have objected that they're looking at the big picture. In the broad scheme of things, Christian holy war, the founders' slaveholding, the Indians' wars, and U.S. racism were no big deal. But each of these moral lapses, even the Nordic racism, led to massive body counts. It wasn't like stealing a cookie. The conservative could more plausibly point out that only a small fraction of Western and American resources were devoted to sheer wickedness. But the same holds true for most notorious criminals. Over 99% of the typical serial killer's days are murder-free. Don't these puritanical standards deprive us of heroes? No, but they heavily thin the applicant pool, for reasons identified by Lord Acton. I cannot accept your canon that we are to judge Pope and King unlike other men, with a favorable presumption that they did no wrong. If there is any presumption, it is against the holders of power, increasing as the power increases. Historic responsibility has to make up for want of legal responsibility. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men. I'm not saying that conservatives' complaints about liberals are unfair. My claim, rather, is that both ideologies have parallel blind spots. The liberal mistake is ignoring all the ways that Western civilization and the United States have been better than the competition. The conservative mistake is ignoring all the ways that Western civilization and the United States have been awful. In slogan form, better is not good. Fortunately, to quote Vanilla Sky, every passing minute is another chance to turn it all around. Columbus Day is tomorrow. It's a great opportunity for conservatives who reject moral relativism to break ranks and stop pretending this historical criminal was a hero. October 12th, 2014. Against trolling. I never troll. My sincerity is controversial enough. In particular, I never A. misrepresent my actual views, or B. try to inspire negative emotions for their own sake. There is nothing transgressive in my heart. While I often expect my writings to upset readers, I always hope to convince everyone, or, failing that, to launch a friendly conversation. Indeed, my dream is a secular universal reconciliation, an intellectual climate where every participant is relentlessly fair-minded and good-humored. Now, you could say that trolling is a loaded word. We can debate whether someone is trolling, but not whether trolling itself is bad. Strangely, though, several people have praised trolling to my face. Their arguments were poorly developed, but seemed to amount to 1. In the world of modern media, trolling is the most effective way to promote unpopular truths. 2. Trolling is fun for the trolls. The first pro-trolling argument is dubious at best. If you want to spread unpopular truth X, you generally need to defend X, not a caricature of X. True, trolling is a good way to get attention and promote in-group solidarity, but it also alienates people who don't initially agree with you. People who want to spread unpopular truths need to overcome the audience's hostility, not court it. The second pro-trolling argument is probably true as far as it goes, but you can say the same about every sadistic pastime. And when someone confesses, "I enjoy hurting people," our reaction is normally to shun the speaker, not conclude that hurting people is good. Of course, the weakness of these arguments doesn't show trolling is bad. What is the case against trolling? Most obviously, trolling hinders the search for truth. The main mechanisms: 1. Opportunity cost. Trolling diverts intellectual resources from the construction of compelling arguments to the elicitation of negative emotions. 2. The argument tax. Even sincere intellectual argument is discouraging. Carefully listening to people we disagree with requires intense effort. So does designing intellectually sound arguments to persuade people who don't already agree. And the payoff for all this mental effort is usually zero. Most conversations end in a stalemate, where everyone sticks with his initial belief. So what do trolls do? Willfully make the process even more emotionally taxing than it already is. 3. The lemons problem. Trolls know what they're doing, but rarely admit it. It's up to their victims to spot the trolls. This information asymmetry yields a classic adverse selection problem. The fact that the person you're arguing with might be a troll makes sincere people more reluctant to argue. As these sincere people exit the conversation, the troll-to-population ratio rises. This, in turn, leads more sincere people to drop out, sparking a downward spiral in argumentative quality. What is the combined effect of all three mechanisms? I can only speculate, but it's easy to believe the search for truth would be 10% faster if trolling vanished forever. To be honest, though, the main reason I don't troll is straight-up Puritanism. Consequences aside, there are strong moral presumptions against insincerity and sadism. Unless the social benefits of insincerity and sadism clearly and heavily outweigh the social costs, you simply shouldn't do them. P.S. The game Are You a Werewolf, perhaps better known as Mafia, puts 2 secret werewolf players against 13 innocent villagers. Every turn, the secret werewolves select a victim to eat. Then the whole village, including the secret werewolves, votes to hang a suspected werewolf. When I play this game, I have an iron rule. Immediately convict anyone who breathes the words, "I'm the werewolf." My reasoning: even if the person isn't the werewolf, he's helping the werewolves by sowing confusion. I treat anyone who says, "I'm a troll," the same way. If you say you're a troll, I believe you, and we have nothing further to discuss. April 20th, 2016. Against winning. When I was a child, adults taught us to look down on bad winners. The maxim, "It's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game." The implicit model was something like, yes, winning is better than losing, all else equal. And yes, there's a trade-off between winning and common decency. But losing with common decency is better than winning without it. If you face a choice between losing and foul play, you should choose to lose. I'm usually skeptical of narratives about the good old days. But when I look at the modern world, the ethic of noble defeat that I vividly remember from my youth seems virtually extinct. When was the last time you witnessed the public shaming of a dishonorable winner? Nary an example comes to my mind. In everything from politics to reality TV, our bottom line is who won, not who deserved to win. The evils of overrating winning are most obvious in violent conflict. During the 20th century, every major power embraced blatant war crimes in the name of victory, even though it's unclear whether these war crimes even helped. The exemplars of sore winner's syndrome, though, are terrorists. They're too weak to win by any conventional means, yet too proud to compromise or submit, so they murder innocents and cross their ets and cross their fingers. It's tempting to accuse the proponents of honorable defeat of bad faith. This is just an attempt to bolster the status quo by guilting its opponents into ineffectual strategies or quietism. But when you're all alone with your conscience, the duty to gracefully lose is hard to deny. I say these words as a perennial political loser. I have little hope that any of my favorite causes will prevail in the foreseeable future. For example, I don't expect to see anything like open borders in my lifetime. I'm happy to try my luck by writing, speaking, and organizing on behalf of freedom of movement. I unabashedly advocate Youmerian civil disobedience to these unjust laws. But if these tactics fail to open the borders, as they almost surely will, I won't resort to anything scarier. Pragmatically, of course, scarier tactics would probably fail or backfire. But my objection is fundamental. Victory by any means necessary is the slogan of a political criminal, and I will have no part in it. Neither should you. September 2nd, 2014. The curious absence of socially conservative economics. Public intellectuals often talk about conservative economics. The truth, though, is that conservative economics is essentially non-existent. Academic economists range from liberal to libertarian. While Republicans are rarely libertarian, Republican economists are the exception that proves the rule. This is a classic dog that didn't bark situation. What can we learn from conservative economics' failure to launch? For starters, note that social conservatism is now the main source of intellectual conflict between libertarians and conservatives. The simplest explanation for the absence of socially conservative economics, then, is that economics doesn't provide any plausible arguments in favor of social conservatism. But the simplest explanation has an obvious problem. Rationalizing social conservatism using Econ 101 is child's play. Just close your eyes, tap your heels 3 times, and say negative externalities. So-called self-regarding behavior clearly impacts your family, yet many people fail to take the interests of their family members into account when they engage in risky behavior. Think about how many people would drastically curtail their use of alcohol, and with illegal drug, and casual sex if they deeply cared about their parents' feelings. Also note that familial love often makes bargaining and punishment ineffective. Most people's parents quickly forgive their kids' broken promises, not to mention their heinous offenses. So why not use government to pick up the slack, to enforce the family values that the family itself is so often impotent to enforce? Once government starts enforcing family values in the interests of intra-family harmony, it's easy to make parallel arguments at the level of the neighborhood, the region, the state, the country, and the world. If your self-regarding behavior can hurt your family members, it can hurt your neighbors, fellow citizens, and humanity itself. This remains true, by the way, when your fellow citizens have no decent argument for their view. In economic terms, widespread distaste for, say, gay marriage can have a massive social cost, even if the only negative side effect of gay marriage is strangers' unreasoning disgust. Normatively, of course, I am not a social conservative, but in purely economic terms, the case for socially conservative economics is surprisingly strong. The main reason I feel little need to critique economic arguments for social conservatism, in all honesty, is that almost no social conservative bothers to make the arguments. My question, why don't they? December 17th, 2013. What's wrong with revenge? Dialogue from 100 interchangeable Law and Order episodes. You didn't want justice, you wanted revenge. The law says thou shalt not kill, not thou shalt not kill nice people. Each time I'm thinking, maybe justice required revenge. Ever think of that? He didn't kill the guy because he wasn't nice. He killed him because he murdered an innocent child, the very thing the state of New York itself might legally kill the victim for. My point, bring up revenge, and most people get upset and speak in platitudes. I'd like to know, what's wrong with revenge? To be more specific, suppose X is the most severe morally acceptable punishment for Act Y committed by person Z. Suppose that the government fails to do anything about Y. What's wrong if a person personally affected by Act Y does X to Z? I won't accept no one has the right to take the law into his own hands as an answer. I want to hear some reasons why no one has this right. A few possibilities. 1. Maybe Z didn't really do Y. This is an argument against misguided revenge, not revenge per se. 2. The person might inflict more than X on Z for doing Y. Again, this is an argument against excessive revenge, not revenge per se. 3. Revenge leads to chaos and/or multiple rounds of reprisal. This seems unduly alarmist. Most people are cowards, and punishing heinous acts is a public good. Even if justified revenge were an affirmative legal defense, few people would take advantage of it. Indeed, if anything, the market undersupplies revenge. 4. X, the most severe morally acceptable punishment, is 0. Besides being crazy, this is an argument against any system of criminal justice, not just revenge. Ever seen the bumper sticker, "Why do we kill people who kill people to show that killing is wrong?" You could just as easily have a bumper sticker saying, "Why do we imprison people who imprison people to show that imprisoning is wrong?" There are other anti-revenge arguments, but I doubt they'll fare much better. What's interesting to me is that while most people officially condemn all acts of revenge, 80% of all action movies depict revenge as not only morally acceptable, but morally required. Sin City is an extreme case, but its stance is mainstream. In the latest Die Hard sequel, thumbs down, BT for example, Bruce Willis keeps saying that he's going to find the bad guys and kill them, not kill them if I must do so in self-defense. My interpretation is that action movies rely on our strong moral intuition about the righteousness of making the bad guys pay. Like a lot of art, action movies work by bypassing sanctimonious propaganda and showing, not saying, important truths that on some level we already know. Truths like, someone who kills the murderer of an innocent child deserves a medal, not a jail sentence. June 1st, 2007. The righteous scofflaw. The most popular argument against illegal immigration is probably that breaking the law is wrong. At least since the Nazis, though, virtually no one believes that breaking the law is always wrong. Instead, we all recognize circumstances under which being a scofflaw is morally acceptable. Law professor Ilya Somin elegantly explains the three leading theories of justified lawbreaking in the Washington Post and applies them to illegal immigration. Let's consider them in order of popularity. 1. Strong presumption. The most popular theory is probably that breaking the law is only justified under desperate circumstances. As Ilya explains, some believe that there is a very strong presumption that can only be overcome by extremely powerful countervailing considerations. For example, perhaps Southern blacks were justified in violating Jim Crow laws in the days of segregation because of the severe harm that those laws inflicted on them. But ordinary Americans today are not justified in violating laws that harm them in more modest ways. This story has an obvious problem. Most of its explicit proponents routinely break laws for trivial reasons. Just look at the fraction of drivers who occasionally exceed the speed limit and picture how they'd react if a passenger morally condemned them for driving 56 miles per hour in a 55 miles per hour zone. In any case, as one of my favorite challenges suggests, illegal immigration easily overcomes even a strong presumption in favor of obeying the law. If anything is enough to overcome the strong presumption, it surely is a situation where obedience forces you and your family into lifelong poverty and oppression that you did nothing to deserve, and violation of the law does not in itself harm anyone. The strong presumption theory might still condemn illegal immigrants who come from advanced liberal democracies such as Canada or Britain. Life in these countries is at worst only modestly less happy and free than in the United States. But the vast majority of illegal immigrants are fleeing far worse condition, often even worse conditions than African Americans endured in the Jim Crow era. 2. Weak presumption. The theory most consistent with people's concrete moral reasoning is that legality only marginally tips the scales of righteousness. Ilya. Many people implicitly assume that there is only a relatively weak moral presumption in favor of obeying the law. If obeying a law is inconvenient and violating it is unlikely to harm anyone, they believe that violation is morally justified. That explains why most people believe it is morally permissible to violate the speed limit laws so long as you don't drive so fast as to seriously endanger other drivers and pedestrians. Strict compliance with the speed limit would be annoying and inconvenient and make it harder for us to get to our appointments on time. Ditto for violations of various federal regulations that ordinary citizens and small business routinely run afoul of. Obeying all of these laws to the letter would be costly and inconvenient, and most people believe it is all right to violate them in cases where there is no significant harm to others. Under the weak presumption, the propriety of illegal immigration is a true no-brainer. Illegal immigrants have a much stronger case for violating immigration laws than native-born citizens do for their routine violations of the speed limit and various petty federal regulations. For most illegal immigrants, obeying the law would harm them a lot more profoundly than merely making it harder to get to work on time. It would consign them to lives of poverty and oppression in the third world, a harsh fate imposed on them through no fault of their own, merely because they were born on the wrong side of a line on the map. 3. No presumption. Ilya closes with the decidedly unpopular view that legality is morally irrelevant. Finally, it is worth noting that scholars such as A. John Simmons and Michael Huemer argue that there is no presumption in favoring of an obligation to obey the law at all. They hold that a moral obligation to obey a law requires something beyond merely the fact that it was enacted by a government, even a democratically elected one. Part of me wishes that Ilya spent more time on the latter theory. After all, it's true. But Ilya made the right choice. Why struggle to sell Washington Post readers on a new philosophy of law when their pre-existing philosophies lead to the same conclusion? April 8, 2014. The unbearable arbitrariness of deploring. As a self-identified non-neurotic man, I'm not surprised by the social ubiquity of anger, sadness, and fear. When something bad happens, my instinctive reaction is to say, "Calm down, it's okay," especially if it doesn't personally affect me. But I recognize that I'm odd. When something bad happens, a psychologically normal person's instinctive reaction is to say, "Oh my God, that's terrible," whether it personally affects them or not. At this point in my life, I'm almost inured to the anger, sadness, and fear that normal people chronically express. They're clearly just built differently than I am. While I suspect they could markedly improve their outlook if they wanted to, they don't want to. Pride, I guess. But while I've grown to accept their general negativity, I'm still astounded by what people choose to be negative about. To my eyes, the specific items that people deplore look deeply arbitrary. Let's start with the latest scandal. People all over the country, indeed the world, have recently discovered that many celebrities are habitual sexual harassers. Each new expose leads to public outrage and professional ostracism. Why does this confuse me? Because many celebrities do many comparably bad things other than sexual harassment, and virtually no one cares. Suppose, for example, that a major celebrity is extremely emotionally abusive to all his subordinates. He screams at them all the time. He calls them the cruelest names he can devise. He habitually makes impossible demands. He threatens to fire them out of sheer sadistic pleasure. But the abuse is never sexual or ethnic. The celebrity limits himself to attacking subordinates' intelligence, character, pride, and hope for the future. I dare say the average employee would far prefer to work for a boss who occasionally pressured them for a date. But if the tabloids ran a negative profile on the asexual boss from hell, the public wouldn't get very mad, and Hollywood almost certainly wouldn't ostracize the offender. A similar point holds for celebrity gropers. When exposed, lots of people proclaim it unforgivable. But if a celebrity repeatedly got into same-sex bar brawls, there would be no outcry. Even if the celebrity received probation after paralyzing an innocent stranger for life, he could probably keep working in show business. Or to take a far more gruesome case, when the Syrian government last used poison gas, killing roughly 100 people, the U.S. angrily deployed retaliatory bombers to bipartisan acclaim. But when the Syrian government murdered vastly more with conventional weapons, the U.S. government and its citizenry barely peeped. The unbearable arbitrariness of deploring. In the past, I've made similar observations about Jim Crow versus immigration laws and My Lai versus Hiroshima. In each case, I can understand why people would have strong negative feelings about both evils. I can understand why people would have strong negative feelings about neither. I can understand why people would have strong negative feelings about the greater evil, but not the lesser evil. But I can't understand why people would have strong negative feelings about the lesser evil, but care little about the greater evil. Or why they would have strong negative feelings about one evil, but yawn in the face of a comparable evil. Well, I'm not at a total loss. Perhaps strangely, I can explain what I cannot accept. When I witness the unbearable arbitrariness of deploring, two unsympathetic types of explanations come to mind. First, people's negative emotions depend far more on the vividness of the evil than its badness. 100 stories about celebrity harassers would upset the world far more than ironclad statistical proof that 10% of celebrities harass. Indeed, it's likely that one detail-rich story about a celebrity harasser would upset the world more than the best statistical study ever performed. Second, people's negative emotions are intensely social. People don't want to rage alone. They want to get mad with their friends and countrymen. So when a new round of ugly stories pop up, almost no one asks, is this really the best target of our collective anger? Instead, they jump on the bandwagon. Who cares where we're going, as long as we're united in negativity? You could insist that my ranking of the seriousness of various offenses is wrong, or at least no more judicious than the broader public's. But even if I'm wrong on the specifics, am I really wrong about the underlying psychology of anger, sadness, and fear? Whatever vexes you, it's hard to deny that vividness and hurting, not intrinsic badness, provide the standard targeting system for human negativity. And if you want to be upset about what really matters, you must start by deploring vividness and hurting, the eternal deceivers of mankind. The Weird is Right. A Nonconformist's Guide to Success in a Conformist World. I've been a nonconformist for as long as I can remember. All the other kids love sports never seemed like a good reason why I should feel, or pretend to feel, the same way. None of the other adults are wearing shorts and flip-flops never seemed like a good reason why I should make myself uncomfortable. It wasn't mere elitism on my part. All the other Princeton economists take general equilibrium models seriously. Was no more compelling to me than all the other teens want their own car. Nonconformism at my intensity rarely allows real-world success. Doing well almost always has a big social element. Going solo gets you nowhere. Yet, by conventional standards, I've succeeded. I have a dream job for life and enough money that I don't think about money. How did I pull it off? Some of it's luck, especially the luck of being in the right place at the right time to meet the right people. Thank you, Tyler Cowen. But in hindsight, I also played my cards fairly well. If you're a nonconformist who hopes to succeed in our conformist world, my favorite strategies will probably work well for you too. In no particular order. 1. Don't be an absolutist nonconformist. Conforming in small ways often gives you the opportunity to nonconform in big ways. Being deferential to your boss, for example, opens up a world of possibilities. 2. Don't proselytize the conformists. Most of them will leave you alone if you leave them alone. Monitor your behavior. Are you trying to change them more often than they try to change you? Then stop. Saving time is much more helpful than making enemies. 3. In modern societies, most demands for conformity are based on empty threats, but not all. So pay close attention to societal sanctions for others' deviant behavior. Let the impulsive nonconformists be your guinea pigs. 4. During childhood, educational institutions' threats are by far the most real. While this is going on your permanent record is usually an empty threat, do as we say or you will suffer at the next educational level is not. Vivid anecdotes about billionaire dropouts aside, the modern labor market remains extremely credentialist, and there's no reason to think this will change anytime soon. 5. A nonconformist attitude toward education is dangerous because academic status is painfully linear and cumulative. To go to college, you must finish high school. To finish high school, you have to finish all the 11th grade requirements, and so on. 6. Fortunately, the content of modern education is neither linear nor cumulative. You can safely forget most of what you didn't feel like learning right after the final exam. 7. Although teachers and students urge you to conform across the board, good grades in hard classes are virtually the only thing with long-run consequences. You can live with C's in PE, or ugly nicknames, or exclusion from the cool kids clique. 8. Educational success hardly guarantees career success, but educational credentials open a lot of doors, including most of the doors to non-conformist-friendly careers in academia, science, and yes, bureaucracies. 9. Most bureaucrats are deeply conformist, but bureaucratic lack of incentives are great for non-conformists. Think job security. 10. Social intelligence can be improved. For non-conformists, the marginal benefit of doing so is especially big. 11. Treat your family fairly, but remember that relatives, especially older relatives, are the lords of empty threats. Despite all their criticism, they probably love you too much to do more than nag you. When faced with demands for conformity, silently ask, "What will happen to me if I refuse?" Train yourself to ponder subtle and indirect repercussions, but learn to dismiss most such ponderings as paranoia. Modern societies are huge, anonymous, and forgetful. 13. Most workplaces are not democracies. This is very good news, because as a nonconformist, you'll probably never be popular. You can, however, make yourself invaluable to key superiors, who in turn will protect and promote you. 14. Spend the first year of any job convincing your employer he was right to hire you, and he'll spend your remaining years on the job convincing you not to leave. This advice is almost equally useful for conformists, by the way. 15. Despite everything, the world has more greatness than you can savor in a lifetime. And in the modern world, finding greatness is remarkably easy. Stop complaining, stop feeling sorry for yourself, and suck the marrow out of life. 16. Hiring your non-conformist friends is a great way to make your life better, but only if they follow these rules too. July 28, 2014. The Better's Oath. Another great thing about my new daughter, she got me to start watching Game of Thrones. The first episode didn't hook me last year, but now I can't stop thinking about the show. I've even been inspired by the Night's Watch oath to write an oath of my own. Here goes. The Better's Oath. Blathering talk surrounds us, but I will take no part in it. My word is my bet. I will always put my money where my mouth is. When challenged, I will bet on my words, refine them, or recant. When no one is present to challenge me, I will weigh my words and thoughts as if my fellow oath-takers were listening. I will make both conditional and unconditional bets and assign probabilities whenever asked. I will claim no false certainty. Unless I will stake my life on my belief, I am not truly certain and will admit it. When I lose a bet, I will admit defeat, pay promptly, and hold my tongue, never protesting that I was really right. If I have caveats or reservations, I will declare them when I make the bet, not after I lose it. When I win a bet, I will not shame my opponent, for a betting loser has far more honor than the mass of men who live by loose and idle talk. I pledge my minds and words to the Better's Oath for this day and all the days to come. Unless something in this oath turns out to be wrong, an eventuality to which I assign a 3% probability. May 5th, 2012. The Case for Libertarian Friendliness. My week at the IHS seminar in Chicago returned a long-lived libertarian meme to my field of vision. The meme, humility. If libertarians want to communicate with a broader audience, we've got to stop being so full of ourselves. So the story goes, but is it true? As I've said before, all radical critiques of the status quo are fundamentally not humble. After all, most people oppose major changes in the status quo, so you can't really advocate big changes unless you think, I'm right, and almost everyone else is wrong. If you've got a humble way to say that, I'd like to hear it. Now, I agree that libertarians could use a public relations makeover. But what we need isn't more humility, but greater friendliness. Smile. Laugh at yourself. Look for and enjoy the good in people who don't agree with you. Appreciate your good fortune to be alive during the best years humanity has ever had. Live by the wisdom of the Godfather. I believe in friendship, and I am willing to show my friendship first. If you've got these traits, you don't really need to be humble to reach a broader audience. And frankly, given the personality of the typical libertarian, friendliness will probably come more readily than humility. July 14th, 2008. Praise, substitution versus income effects. Touchy-feely parents shower praise on their kids. Great job. You're super smart. Wonderful. Old school parents do the opposite. You could have done better. That won't get you into Harvard. Why the chasm? The real story, I suspect, is emotional rather than strategic. Parents praise or withhold because that's what feels right to them. The charitable story, though, is that strategy is central. The two archetypes factually disagree about the effect of praise on performance and act accordingly. The pro-praise story. Praise is a form of reward. The greater the rewards of success, the more effort kids exert. The anti-praise story. Yes, praise is a form of reward, but the more rewards kids rack up, the more satisfied they feel. The more satisfied they feel, the less effort kids exert. Framed this way, the pro and anti-praise debate boils down to the intermediate micro-analysis of the substitution and income effects. Does paying people more or taxing them less make them work more or less? The strange but true answer is, it depends. The greater the rewards, the greater the effort makes sense. But so does the more rewards you have, the less you crave further rewards. The great to praise or not to praise debate fits elegantly into this framework. Or does it? Consider, touchy-feel parents also typically avoid shaming their kids. Old-school parents, in contrast, shame freely. Here, then, old-school parents seem to rely on the substitution effect. The greater the cost of bad behavior, the smaller the quantity. Touchy-feely parents, in contrast, seem to tacitly appeal to the income effect. A shamed kid will act even worse because he has so little left to lose. Personally, my parenting style embraces the substitution effect in both directions. I happily praise good behavior and sternly, though not angrily, criticize bad behavior. That's definitely more consistent than either of the classic archetypes and seems to work well for my kids. But perhaps that's an illusion or an outlier. From a bird's eye view, which view of praise and blame has the facts on its side? February 16, 2016. Practicing what I preach, how I fight statistical discrimination. In a recent post, I said, if you really want to improve your group's image, telling other groups to stop stereotyping won't work. The stereotype is based on the underlying distribution of fact. It is far more realistic to turn your complaining inward and pressure the bad apples in your group to stop pulling down the average. I'll admit that this sounds a bit harsh, maybe more than a bit, but before you write me off for my insensitivity, let me say that I follow my own advice. I'm a libertarian economist, and as a libertarian economist, I face an array of negative stereotypes from mainstream economists, which in turn lead to statistical discrimination. Here are a few of the stereotypes. 1. Libertarian economists can't do math. 2. Libertarian economists are just ideologues. 3. Libertarian economists don't understand market failure arguments. 4. Libertarian economists are insufferable jerks. There are roughly 2 ways I could try to diffuse this problem. 1. Preach to mainstream economists. Stop stereotyping us and pretend like there's no truth to these generalizations. 2. Preach to other libertarian economists. Let's improve our image by improving ourselves. I've been trying to do the latter for about a decade. For example, I wrote my essay, Why I Am Not an Austrian Economist, because I think that libertarian economists are disproportionately ideologues who don't understand market failure arguments. There's no use pretending it isn't so. For another paper I've written against mistaken views common in libertarian circles, see here. See also my debate with Pete Boettke. Telling mainstream economists the stereotype is false because some libertarian economists don't fit it, look at Milton Friedman, is scarcely better than naked denial. Obviously, every stereotype has exceptions. Stereotypes are useful because they are better than nothing, not because they are infallible. It's far more productive, then, for me to exhort other libertarian economists to not be ideologues and get a firm grip on market failure arguments. Fight the stereotype by making it less true, instead of pressuring others to ignore what's right in front of their faces. Similarly, when libertarian economists make mathematical mistakes, I try to correct them. If it were just a random economist, I wouldn't bother. But when a libertarian economist maintains that utility functions are cardinal, he drags down our average math score. Admittedly, there are limits to my strategy. Another stereotype of libertarian economists is that they oppose discrimination laws. It's true, but I wouldn't try to undermine the stereotype because I think it's the right position. Of course, I would like to undermine the stereotype that we don't have good arguments for this position by making good arguments, but that's a different matter. So am I saying that discrimination against libertarian economists is basically just statistics, not discussed? That's going too far. As I've previously argued, nonprofits such as universities are a lot more likely to let taste-based discrimination survive than for-profits. What I am saying is that libertarian economists should recognize that negative stereotypes about them are grounded in fact, and the way to fight those stereotypes is to change the facts. September 28, 2005. Sorry for whatever. Last week, I posed the following question on Twitter. Why is I don't really understand what I did to upset you, but I'm sincerely sorry for whatever it was so ineffective? If you respond, because figuring out how you upset someone is easy, you are crazy. Few of the responses impressed me, but perhaps that's because I failed to flesh out the hypothetical. I'm picturing a scenario where A. The speaker speaks in a sincere tone of voice. B. The listener has failed to directly say, I am upset with you because X. C. The speaker has asked, what did I do to upset you? And the listener has refused to provide any direct answer. In my experience, this situation is common. The main reason people say, I don't really understand what I did to upset you, but I'm sincerely sorry for whatever it was, is to restore amicable relations despite the speaker's befuddlement. And while I'm well aware that this is an ineffective strategy, I'd really like to know why. What was so unsatisfactory about my respondents' exegesis? Most of them seem to assume, despite my warning, that figuring out how you upset someone is easy, and that's patently untrue. Several respondents suggested that only Aspies and autistics struggle to figure out the source of others' malcontent. Absurd. Neurotypicals badly misunderstand each other all the time. Look at any playground or Thanksgiving dinner. What's really going on? Here are a few stories worth considering. 1. Individuals falsely imagine that their emotions are easy for others to grasp. It's a trick of introspection. Since the reason why you're upset is usually obvious to you, you naively infer that such reasons are obvious to all. If others claim otherwise, they must be playing dumb. 2. Individuals are too impulsive to ponder whether their emotions are easy to grasp. But when they're angry, humiliating, and tormenting, whoever upset them feels good. And the sarcastic mad, what makes you think I'm mad, is well engineered for humiliation and torment. 3. Individuals know that their emotions are not easy for others to grasp, but they strategically pretend otherwise to punish and assert dominance. You could claim that pressuring others to figure out why you're mad is educational. Why am I mad? You tell me, sounds like a Socratic seminar. However, it's hard to believe that many people simultaneously feel angry and didactic. The best response came from University of Chicago philosopher Agnes Callard. Because what the person who is upset at you wants, first and foremost, is not your apology or atonement, but your understanding of what you did and of what they suffered as a result. Your speech suggests ignorance on both fronts. But if the listener genuinely wanted your understanding, why wouldn't they simply tell you why they're upset? Or at least tell you when asked? To repeat, I fully understand why people would respond poorly to a sarcastic or resentful, sorry for whatever I did. As long as the tone is well-meaning, however, you should accept this apology with joy. Would I? Absolutely. By the way, I would love to get an apology half as good as, I don't really understand what I did to upset you, but I'm sincerely sorry for whatever it was, from anyone who has treated me poorly. I instantly forgive the next person who says this to me. Per Dale Carnegie, I apologize to others often. I average about 10 apologies per day. It costs me nothing, makes the people around me feel better, and helps me be a better person. If I've upset you yet failed to apologize, the reason is probably that I haven't noticed that anything is wrong or can't figure out what it is. I'm not a mind reader. Yet if you directly tell me what's amiss, I will strive to make things right. January 7th, 2021. Against Apology Perfectionism. After last week's post on apologies, a few readers sent me links on the psychology of effective apologies. Maximally effective apologies include the following elements. Expression of regret. explanation of what went wrong, acknowledgement of responsibility, declaration of repentance, offer of repair, request for forgiveness. A similar piece elaborates, taking responsibility means acknowledging mistakes you made that hurt the other person, and it's one of the most important and neglected ingredients of most apologies, especially those in the media. Saying something vague like, "I'm sorry if you were offended by something I said," implies that the hurt feelings were a random reaction on the part of the other person. Saying, "When I said the hurtful thing, I wasn't thinking. I realize I hurt your feelings, and I'm sorry," acknowledges that you know what it was you said that hurt the other person, and you take responsibility for it. Overall, this seems like plausible advice. Ideal apologies will indeed have all 6 elements. The harsh reality, though, is that ideal apologies often require the superpower of telepathy. Why? Because the person who wants to apologize doesn't understand why the other person is upset, and the person who wants an apology refuses to explain themselves. So, unless the would-be apologizer can read minds, "sorry for whatever I did" is the best he can do. The bigger question, though, is how will people actually use this research? Will they learn to make better apologies, or simply to expect better apologies? I suspect that the latter effect will far exceed the former. If this suspicion is correct, the ironic result of this research is to exacerbate conflict rather than diffuse it. Why do I have this pessimistic view? For starters, as far as I can recall, I have never received an ideal apology, or anything close to it. In fact, I doubt I've received a dozen halfway decent apologies in my entire life. If I held this dearth against people, I wouldn't have a friend left in the world. Instead of expecting apologies from others, I generally make excuses on their behalf. My motives are partly strategic and partly sincere. Strategically speaking, I know that demanding good apologies won't work. People are stubborn and self-righteous. Unless I bite my tongue and appease them, I will be very lonely. You could object, with friends like that, who needs enemies? But if a friend unapologetically tramples my feelings 5 days a year, but makes me happy the other 360 days, I count myself lucky. Sincerely speaking, I know that lively social interaction is an inherently risky activity. Boring, superficial conversations are safe. Nice weather we're having? Yes, quite. As soon as you stray from that time-worn path, you might accidentally say the wrong thing. So if someone hurts your feelings as a result, the wise reaction is normally, "It's all part of the game, no big deal." Wouldn't I like to receive an apology every now and then? Sure. Wouldn't I prefer apologies that contain an expression of regret, explanation of what went wrong, acknowledgement of responsibility, declaration of repentance, offer of repair, and request for forgiveness? Sure again. But in my book, even a "sorry I hurt your feelings" with a sincere tone is amazingly above the bar. If offered, I'll cheerfully take it. So should you. January 12th, 2021. Tolerance before empathy. Suppose you have a ne'er-do-well cousin, a long-term alcoholic and drug addict. He's been arrested about 30 times, though never convicted of a felony. One day, he comes to your door and tells you a largely accurate history of his troubled life, from childhood to the present. He admits that many of his troubles are his own fault and accepts responsibility for them. Then, he hits you up for money, as he's done many times before. How do you react? If you're like most people, you'll feel a blend of frustration, impatience, and pity. Sure, he came from a broken home. Sure, he's had bad luck. But if these were his only problems, he wouldn't need your help. And you've helped him so many times already. Looking at your cousin fills you with sadness, but the thought of bailing him out for the umpteenth time fills you with disgust. Trapped between your conflicting negative emotions, you hesitate long enough for a nosy neighbor to wander over and ask, "What wrong?" Before you can stop him, your cousin repeats his story. The nosy neighbor's face turns red with anger at you. He reads you the riot act. "How can you be so lacking in empathy?" he asks. "You were born on third base, yet you fault your cousin for failing to hit a home run. You sicken me." Should you help your cousin? Reasonable people are likely to disagree. But whatever you decide, your nosy neighbor is plainly and completely out of line. Yes, there are some plausible reasons to say yes to your cousin, but there are also plenty of plausible reasons to say no. It's tempting to ask your neighbor to show some empathy for your awkward position. But what's awful about Mr. Nosy is that he fails to show you something more basic: tolerance. Instead of preaching at you, your neighbor should admit that there are decent arguments on both sides and butt out. At the individual level, I doubt many people will dispute my perspective. Why bring it up? Because in his recent piece on poverty, Nicholas Kristof perfectly plays the part of society's nosy neighbor. After acknowledging the connection between poverty and bad choices, Kristof lashes out at people who oppose a renewed war on poverty for their lack of empathy. Too often, wealthy people born on third base blithely criticize the poor for failing to hit home runs. The advantaged sometimes perceive empathy as a sign of muddle-headed weakness, rather than as a marker for civilization. And this crisis in working-class America doesn't get the attention it deserves, perhaps because most of us in the chattering class aren't a part of it. There are steps which could help, including a higher minimum wage, early childhood programs, and a focus on education as an escalator to opportunity. But the essential starting point is empathy. If you had a ne'er-do-well cousin, I'm almost sure Kristof would be a tolerant man. He'd acknowledge the moral complexity of the situation. He'd admit that you might be right to refuse your cousin. Whatever you decided, he'd keep his opinion to himself unless you explicitly requested his counsel. My question: why can't he be equally tolerant of people who say that the crisis in working-class America is not their fault and not their problem? August 19th, 2014. How I love education. When I write about education, I suspect I come off as a Philistine. You might even boil my position down to: students are bored and aren't acquiring job skills, so their education is a waste of time and money. But what about learning for its own sake? Why do I seem so close to the possibility that education is a merit good that human beings ought to consume to uplift their souls? This question is awkward for me because, unlike many economists and libertarians, I actually believe in merit goods. For example, I believe that opera, especially 19th century German opera, is the objective pinnacle of musical achievement. Given my stance, it's also natural to see great intrinsic value in the study of philosophy, history, literature, and the like. Truth be told, impractical education is central to my whole sense of identity. How can I live with myself when I ridicule the magic of education, too? My answer: I love education too much to respect the mediocre substitutes that schools actually offer. How do these substitutes fall short of my ideals? One education like opera is only a merit good when it's done right. Real-world opera, happily, usually is done right. Real-world education, in contrast, is a travesty. Most educators are boring. They fail to bring the liveliest of subjects to life. They focus on irrelevant details and hollow technique. And in the social sciences and humanities, many of the great ideas and great thinkers aren't just wrong, but stupidly wrong. Take Marxism. As far as I'm concerned, it's no more a merit good than creation science. Grasping the thoughts of economically illiterate 19th century hate-mongers is not a crucial ingredient of a life well lived. 2. Education, like opera, is only a merit good when experienced by minds capable of seriously appreciating it. Exposing bright, artistic minds to opera is great. Pushing opera on apathetic NASCAR fans is a waste of time and can easily ruin the experience for genuine opera aficionados. The same goes for philosophy, history, literature, and the like. Exposing bright, logical minds to philosophy is great. Pushing philosophy on apathetic undergraduates is a waste of time at best. Sure, there's some uncertainty about who's really open to great ideas, but there's far less uncertainty than educators like to tell themselves. Convincing a random student that epistemology is fascinating is virtually impossible. In the typical UC Berkeley class for philosophy majors, I rarely found more than 2 or 3 students who cared enough about the subject to study it on their own initiative. Can't education be improved? Yes, but major reform is unlikely. As long as professors make money while ruining great subjects, and the labor market rewards students for feigning interest, the charade will go on. My standards may seem unreasonably high, but they're typically realized in, for example, the Institute of Humane Studies summer seminars. A few professors who love teaching and have something they're burning to say deliver 2 or 3 lectures apiece. A few dozen self-selected students from around the world show up and happily participate. The students receive no academic credit, just a week of learning, sharing, and debating mind-blowing ideas. I love these summer seminars. They're beautiful, they're a merit good, and they bear almost no resemblance to the official coursework students have to endure to get a diploma. July 18th, 2012. Commentary on Captain Fantastic. Warning, packed with Captain Fantastic spoilers. Few movies speak to me more personally than Captain Fantastic. It's not just a movie about homeschooling, it's a movie about natalist homeschoolers living in a nearly airtight bubble. And psychologically, the movie's patriarch eerily resembles me. Captain Fantastic raises his 6 kids with kindness, respect, and the power of ideas, scrupulously avoiding the parental urge to dominate youths with anger, fear, or sadness. I say this even though the content of Captain Fantastic's ideas leaves much to be desired. My commentary on Captain Fantastic in no particular order. 1. On the surface, Captain Fantastic is a leftist cliché, not just a socialist living off the grid, but a cultish Chomsky fan. But I've never seen a socialist remotely like him. He's not just amazingly open to reasoned argument, his intellectual style is perfectly calm and genuinely friendly. 2. Captain Fantastic is a full-blown economic illiterate. When he looks at stores, all he can see is capitalists gutting American democracy. The idea that stores make life easier, freeing up time for more worthwhile pursuits, is alien to him. So is the idea that modern technology makes primitive survival skills obsolete. 3. In the real world, openness to reasoned argument and economic illiteracy do not long coexist. Anyone as intellectually curious as Captain Fantastic would soon encounter Econ 1. Anyone as calm and friendly as he would quickly come to appreciate the cogency of basic economic principles. And while Econ 1 wouldn't make him a free market radical, it would forever eradicate his socialism and primitivism. My idea of heaven is teaching Econ 1 to Captain Fantastic and his 6 kids, and watching the light bulbs turn on one by one. 4. Captain Fantastic's academic curriculum is admirable but flawed. The chief problem, it revolves around the great books. Though I've devoted years to these works, I'm no longer a big fan. While the great books were impressive in their day, they're stuffed with flimsy arguments and short on credible empirics. Rare gems aside, I hold to this grim verdict even when I largely agree with author's conclusion. If you want to understand modern economies, Cowan and Tabarrok's Modern Principles of Economics will teach you far more than Smith's Wealth of Nations. 5. What's the alternative? A curriculum that revolves around not great books, but basic facts. Learn the global and historical distribution of GDP. Grasp the basics of intelligence and personality psychology. Instead of reading Marx, read quick overviews of Marxism and its critics, then study the political and economic history of Marxist regimes in great detail. I dare say that Captain Fantastic's eldest son wouldn't be an avowed Maoist if he knew the basic facts about what Mao really did and why. Or to take a far less egregious case, I would have loved to see Captain Fantastic's kids test their rhetorical objections to Citizens United against the social science of campaign finance. 6. Captain Fantastic is a case study in weird collectivism. Despite the family's bizarre countercultural lifestyle, their favorite slogan is, "Power to the people." How can they not realize that if they were paying attention, the people would view their family with antipathy and casually crush their family's experiment in living? Captain Fantastic treats his homeschooling as all or nothing. Either you do it his way or you surrender to the mediocrity of the world. One of the first lessons in Econ 1 is that this binary thinking is counterproductive drivel. Life is permeated with endless adjustable margins, and each of these margins is an opportunity for progress. His kids want to try hamburgers? At least let them try one. His kids are clueless about the real world? Let them spend 2 weeks with their suburban cousins to broaden their horizons. Mountain climbing is too dangerous for little kids? You can switch to something safer without sending your kids to a public school that will bore them out of their minds. 8. Captain Fantastic's love of parental candor is touching and exemplary. He consistently answers even his youngest kid's awkward questions with clarity and comfort. This upsets his sister, but she's simply wrong. With very rare exceptions, kids handle the truth well. They're also good lie detectors. If the truth is scary enough to give a kid nightmares, don't lie. Say, "I'll tell you when you're older." Otherwise, answer their questions and reap the greatest fruit of the virtue of honesty, your children's trust. 9. I wish Captain Fantastic had been a fan of Thomas Szasz instead of Noam Chomsky. He tells his kids that their bipolar mom's brain can't transmit electrical signals, but somehow that doesn't stop her from lobbying to rejoin society, helping their son secretly apply to elite colleges, or writing a daddiest will to outrage her square parents. 10. Captain Fantastic's Chomsky idolatry barely bothered me, but it's objectively awful. Economic illiteracy aside, Chomsky's long history of apologizing for totalitarian socialist regimes makes it absurd to treat him as a paladin of human rights. Like Howard Zinn, Chomsky is the kind of pacifist who gives pacifism a bad name. 11. On balance, I would have hated being raised by Captain Fantastic. I would have loved the intellectual experience and his charming personality, but I would have grown to hate his primitivism and asceticism, and my negativity would have gradually poisoned an otherwise idyllic experience. In slogan form, there's nothing wrong with Captain Fantastic's parenting that suburban living and Econ 1 wouldn't fix. 12. Since the 60s, radical lifestyle experiments and left-wing ideology have normally been a package deal. When radical lifestyle experiments perform poorly, outsiders usually treat it as proof that radical lifestyle experiments are bad. Critical reviews of Captain Fantastic tend to draw this very lesson. But given the confounding variable of left-wing ideology, this is a rush to judgment. Maybe the real problem is leftism, not radicalism. 13. What would radical lifestyle experimentation without leftism look like? Start with a heavy dose of super forecasting and the betting norm. Radicalism is no excuse for wishful or unempirical thinking. Indeed, the more radical your dreams, the more you need to test your dreams against harsh reality. 14. I've already seen Captain Fantastic twice. Overall review, 9/10. If it weren't fascinating on many levels, I wouldn't bother to criticize it. I grinned through 90% of the movie. See it. August 29th, 2016. A portrait of my school. If I created my own school, what would it be like? Picture something like this. 1. The school has two goals: to A. prepare students for independent adult life, and B. give them a fun childhood. 2. Pursuant to 1A, all students do at least 90 minutes of math every day. Most high-status jobs require good math skills, and that's unlikely to change. So even if you don't enjoy math, I insist on it. 3. Pursuant to 1B, this is a traditional face-to-fact school where kids talk and play together, without masks. Since I envision a very small school, 5 to 15 students total, I deem the risk acceptable. 4. I admit only highly motivated high school students and extremely highly motivated younger students. My pedagogical approach only works well for kids who are eager to learn, and teaching kids who aren't eager to learn works poorly for me. 5. All students have a detailed schedule for my benefit as well as theirs. Younger students have a schedule handed down to them. As they advance, they gradually take over their own scheduling. I revise these schedules as more information about students' performance and interests arrives. 6. Every student gets personal feedback with their math every day. If they're struggling, they get extra practice. If they're excelling, they move on to the next level. The rest of the curriculum depends on the student. All students spend ample time reading and writing, but what they read and write is up to them. When the student has a good draft of a writing project, they get personal feedback on content, style, spelling, and grammar. 8. General rule. If students are struggling with their work, they start by Googling. If that doesn't work, they ask more knowledgeable students. If that doesn't work, they ask me during standard feedback time. 9. I give students near zero homework and parents no work of any kind, and no lame projects. Instead, we do the real thing. If you want to learn Spanish, you don't make an English language poster on Ecuador. You do daily language immersion. No inglés. 10. I supply all textbooks. They'll often be a few editions old because that cuts costs by 90+% with near zero learning loss. 11. For structure and external certification, all students train for at least one high-quality standardized test. I am especially fond of the advanced placement tests. My older sons took their first in 7th grade and completed 13 APs each by the end of 11th grade. 12. After mastering tested material, students spend at least a month on full-time test prep. During this time, I give students next-day feedback on their performance, especially essays. I fully support teaching to the test when the test is a well-crafted effort to measure deep understanding of the subject. CEG, all of the advanced placement tests in history. 13. Philosophically, my school focuses on intellectually demanding material. Mastery means you can apply the material creatively in new contexts and explain it well to others. 14. At the same time, my school studiously avoids the latest moral fads and moral panics and requires politeness and calm. I tell my students the same thing I tell my kids. Be friendly and don't be touchy. 15. Do I merely replace mainstream indoctrination with my own? The typical observer would probably say so, but they'd be wrong. Yes, I freely share my controversial views when they're germane, but I also carefully explain the normal view, my critique of the normal view's response, and so on. And I do so without the moral blackmail of, "You're a benighted soul if you disagree," or the obtuse, "What do you mean you disagree?" 16. I raise my kids without social desirability bias. I do not respond to earnest questions with sugar-coated answers. I do not parrot fashionable platitudes. I either speak the plain truth or tell them, "Ask me when you're older." I treat all my students the same way. How much demand would there be for such a school? Probably not much, but I wouldn't want more than 15 students anyway. P.S. To repeat, I'm only toying with the idea of sharing my educational model with non-family members. But if you are a prospective customer, please email me. September 1st, 2020. A mythical micro-meeting. I recently discussed the teaching of PhD microeconomics with a noted professor in a top 5 econ department. His bottom line: the curriculum is virtually the same as it was when I took PhD micro a quarter century ago. Among active researchers, the status of pure theory has dramatically fallen during that period, but pure theorists retain a stranglehold over the first-year curriculum. This surpasses even my pessimistic expectations for the education system. I would have thought that top schools would have at least marginally decreased pure theory in favor of empirical work. But at least according to my source, this hasn't happened. Rather than decry this stasis, however, I thought it best to write a dialogue. The scene: meeting room at a prestigious university. The cast: Professor Proof, old-school micro teacher. Professor Reyes, radical curriculum reformer. Professor, well, swing voter on the curriculum committee. I just reread your PhD micro syllabus, Professor Proof. Frankly, it's ridiculous. You haven't changed the content in a quarter century. You make zero effort to introduce students to any of the great empirical work that's been done in the meanwhile. Instead, you waste a year of their lives on useless math. Enough is enough. Proof, relax, Reyes. Students have plenty of time to learn empirical work later on. The point of PhD micro is to train economists in the fundamental ideas of their discipline. That's what I set out to do when I wrote the syllabus 25 years ago, and that's what I'll continue to do. Well, let's take it down a notch. We're the curriculum committee, so we have to work together, Reyes, and the chairman appointed us to reach a consensus. Proof. You can't just stonewall. Fine. Well, let's start with Reyes. What exactly is wrong with PhD micro as is? Reyes. We spend the whole year teaching mountains of irrelevant math and theory. The opportunity cost is high because we could spend that time teaching promising young minds about how the economy actually works, not to mention basic economic principles. And it's a needless entry barrier for students who care about the real world. Proof: irrelevant math and theory, so we should just become sociologists. Raise: I never said that. I'm all for teaching math that students are likely to use in their research and theories that actually shed light on the real world. That's already what I do. Oh, really? Students are likely to use topology in their research? Many do. Name one. Well, 2 years ago, my student Chloe used topology in her dissertation. And for her sake, all her classmates had to spend weeks suffering through the subject? Proof: suffering, it was their privilege. Topology is one of the most beautiful branches of mathematics. See what I'm talking about, Prof. Well? This is all about micro-theorists' bizarre aesthetics. It's got nothing to do with training future economists. Well, here, I'm inclined to agree. If you want to teach math because of its intrinsic beauty, proof, you should do it in a math department. Even so, you need topology to grasp basic economic theorems, starting with general equilibrium theory. Naturally, theorists need topology to prove the theorems, but that hardly means that students need to learn topology. Why not just give the intuition behind the theorem, point the rare future theorists to some reference works, and move on? A single lecture would suffice. Proof: a single lecture? This is a top 5 economics department, and you want us to turn out a generation of ignoramuses? Just tell me this. How empirically relevant is general equilibrium theory anyway? Proof: there are many applications. How many rely on more than a quick intuitive version of GE theory? That's hardly the point. More importantly, how many of our students realize that the sparse empirical applications of GE theory rely on no more than a quick intuitive version of the theory? That would hardly motivate them to study the topic. In other words, you keep your students in ignorance of the deep irrelevance of what you're teaching them, because otherwise they'd be less motivated to study it. Well, surely you're not proposing that we cut theory altogether, Raise? Far from it. I think we should be teaching empirically relevant theory, using as much math as empirical researchers need to know. And according to you, what would qualify? Raise: basic supply and demand for starters, game theory, information economics. Doesn't sound too different from what we already do. Actually, it is. First, I wouldn't teach any more math than you actually need to grasp the intuitive idea. And second, I would immediately follow any theoretical topic with relevant empirics. Proof: but often the relevant empirics directly contradict the theory. See much of behavioral economics. That's a bingo. Our students ought to learn the extent to which standard economic theory correctly describes the real world. I don't mind teaching influential flawed theories, as long as students realize the severity of their flaws. Well, I'm worried that our students will barely remain economists if we follow your advice. Look, what's intellectually distinctive about economists isn't our knowledge of math. It's our rejection of social desirability bias. What? You know how economists are always saying, look at what people do, not what they say. Proof: yes. Yeah? Well, psychologists have empirically confirmed that we're onto something. When the truth sounds bad, people tend to say, and often believe, falsehoods. Psychologists call this social desirability bias. Proof: what in the world does this have to do with PhD micro? Plenty. One of the main goals of PhD micro should be to root out social desirability bias from our students. It's central to thinking like an economist. What, stuff like, if you put an infinite value on life, you'd never cross the street. Exactly. Some of the wisest words ever said. Proof: you want to replace general equilibrium theory with a bunch of trivial slogans? They're deep truths, not trivial slogans. Yet many of your students have barely heard them. Proof: could you name others? Sure. I'll express them as slogans, though each deserves multiple lectures of elaboration. If you're right, why hasn't anyone gotten rich using your idea? What are the relevant elasticities? What precisely is the market failure supposed to be? What are the regulators' incentives? Immigration is trade in labor. So you want to politicize PhD micro. Great. Well, I have to admit that I share Proof's concerns, Rays. This isn't science. If it's true and important, who cares if it's science? See, well, Rays doesn't even believe in science. Rays, losing his cool. Fine, I misspoke. Yay, science. My point remains. We should radically overhaul our PhD micro-curriculum. Proof should stop wasting his students' time with irrelevant math and theory. He should teach them how the economy actually works, delving into math and theory only insofar as it serves that goal. None of this will turn out students into sociologists, as long as he instills the deep truths of economics along the way. I see. Actually, since we could never trust Proof to do any of this, you should hand his class over to me. Glares daggers. Very well. I think I have enough information to make my recommendation to the chairman. Raisin, namely. Well, you both make good points. I'm going to ask the chairman to ask Proof to update his syllabus in light of the last quarter century of research. And that should do it. But that will change next to nothing. Proof will be the sole judge of what needs to be updated. I promise I'll do a scrupulous job. Well, please see that you do. We'll revisit this issue again in 3 years to see how things are going. Until then, colleagues. June 22nd, 2018. Parenthood as the trump of all past regret. I don't regret anything in my life prior to the conception of my sons. This may sound like sentimental nonsense, but I tell you it's true. Here's my argument. 1. Basic biology. A man produces hundreds of millions of sperm every day. Each of these sperm contains half of the genetic blueprint for a different person. The slightest physical movement changes the position of sperm. 2. Therefore, any change in my life prior to my children's conception would have led my children not to exist. If I had crossed my legs differently, or walked to the frig, or even chuckled an extra time, the sperm would have been rearranged, negating my children's existence. I might have had different children, of course, but they wouldn't be the ones I have. 3. Like most parents, I have a massive endowment effect vis-a-vis my children. I love them greatly simply because they exist and they're mine. If you offered to replace one of my sons with another biological child who was better in every objective way, I definitely refuse. 4. Therefore, if you offered me a do-over on any aspect of my life prior to my children's conception, I would refuse, for it would mean that these specific children would never have been born. 5. Since I wouldn't want to change any event prior to my children's conception, I have nothing to regret. And since I have nothing to regret during this period, I don't regret anything. Note that this argument only rules out regret prior to the conception of your last child. Events between the final conception and the present wouldn't change the identity of your children, so the argument from the endowment effect doesn't apply. It also doesn't apply if you wish you'd had a different child or no child at all. But your child has to be pretty rotten to warrant such a wish. No? If you think this is just my egghead way of saying Happy Father's Day, you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. What I'm really saying is that if you love your children just because they're the ones you got, you have a special reason to be happy every day. After all, you can survey your whole life before your last child's conception and honestly say, it all happened for a reason. I wouldn't change a thing. P.S. Happy Father's Day, and if you're reading this, Dad, thanks. June 16th, 2008. Non-conformist candor. Call it sour grapes. I got my PhD in economics from Princeton in 1997. 23 years after graduation, I remain a professor at a mid-ranked school. The odds that I'll ever get a job at a top 20 department look awfully low. How do I feel about this situation? The socially approved response, at least within social science, is to feel and express deep admiration for the plainly superior researchers at top schools. I'm supposed to defer to their judgment on not only A, which research methods are kosher, but also B, what research topics are worthwhile. If I apply myself, perhaps I can usefully, if humbly, extend their work. The more common responses of lower status academics, of course, are jealousy and laziness. Jealousy, because faculty at higher ranked schools so outshine the rest of us. Laziness, because deep down faculty at lower ranked school know they lack the skills to do real research. Most aren't even good enough to usefully, if humbly, extend the work of their betters. Call it sour grapes, but I don't respond to my situation in any of these ways. With rare exceptions, I don't admire researchers at top schools or try to humbly build on their work. At the same time, I'm not lazy, and in all sincerity, I am not jealous. Why not? To be blunt, I deny the value of almost all of the social science research going on at top schools. My reaction to 95% of the articles published in top economics journals isn't so much, "that's wrong," as "so what?" I recognize that getting accepted by these journals requires enormous intelligence, training, and effort. Unless you believe in the labor theory of value, however, the cost of creating top publications implies nothing about the value of creating top publications. And in my considered judgment, the value of top publications is low. When I was in grad school, economists won big for pure and utterly irrelevant mathematical theory. These days, economists win big for running bulletproof randomized controlled trials on trivial topics. Yes, there are exceptions. Phil Tetlock, Ed Glazer, Lant Pritchett, and Richard Thaler leap to mind. Yet the rule remains, the intellectual value of top publications is low. Does anything better exist? Definitely. What is it? The kind of research I do, of course. Plenty of scholars do what I consider my kind of work, but let's focus on me. False modesty aside, I judge my work better than most of the work done by researchers at top schools. Indeed, I judge my work to be vastly superior. That's why I do it. How so? At minimum, books like The Myth of the Rational Voter and The Case Against Education attempt to answer social questions of great significance. Why do democracies choose bad policies? Why is there a gulf between learning and earning? I say struggling with a great question is better than definitively answering a trivial one. And since I predictably think my books actually deliver high-quality answers to these great questions, my sense of self-satisfaction with my intellectual output is through the roof. In fact, I'd go further. Call me a megalomaniac, but in my heart of hearts, I deem dozens of my blog posts to be more valuable intellectual contributions than the typical article published in top social science journals. Consider my The Public Goods Model versus Social Desirability Bias. This wee article shows that the so-called telltale sign of public goods, people collectively voting for goods they don't individually purchase, could just as easily reflect social desirability bias. A simple point? Yes. But I don't think I've ever heard another economist clearly acknowledge this observational equivalence. So what? This simple point calls into question the efficiency of many trillions of dollars of government spending around the world. Few economists at top schools have written anything to rival this solitary blog post. You could retort, okay, then why aren't you seething with jealousy? Simple. I'm not jealous of researchers at top schools because I would hate to trade places with most of them. I would rather do what I do at George Mason than what Harvard researchers do at Harvard. Indeed, it's not even close. Yes, I would prefer a world where Harvard placed supreme value on my kind of work. After all, I am a chronic daydreamer. Yet long ago, I hedonically adapted to society's wretched priorities. Instead of feeling mad at the world, I rejoice that I get paid to do the work that means the world to me. P.S. If you have tenure at a top school, none of my negativity should depress you. Today is the first day of the rest of your career. Why not chuck conventional standards and start doing research that really matters to you and the world? If you want to chat about how to get started, just email me. December 16th, 2020. No paper is that good. Last year, Noah Smith proposed his two-paper rule. If you want me to read the vast literature, cite me two papers that are exemplars and paragons of that literature. Foundational papers, key recent innovations, whatever you like, but no review papers or summaries, just two. I will read them. If these two papers are full of mistakes and bad reasoning, I will feel free to skip the rest of the vast literature. Because if that's the best you can do, I've seen enough. If these two papers contain little or no original work and merely link to other papers, I will also feel free to skip the rest of the vast literature. Because you could have just referred me to the papers cited instead of making me go through an extra layer, I will assume your vast literature is likely to be a mud moat. And if you can't cite two papers that serve as paragons or exemplars of the vast literature, it means that the knowledge contained in that vast literature must be very diffuse and sparse, which means it has a high likelihood of being a mud moat. I never faced Noah's challenge. Why not? To be totally honest, because I don't know of any empirical papers that meet Noah's standards. Yes, there are some literature reviews that I consider excellent, like Clemens's $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk article or Barnett and Cece's piece on transfer of learning, but I'd be loath to point to any specific piece of research and call it a paragon or exemplar. Every article I've carefully examined has issues, no matter how I firmly agree with the conclusions. The highest compliments I'm comfortable paying a paper are careful and cool, never compelling or clearly right. My slogan, no paper is that good. What's wrong with every specific empirical paper? First and foremost, external validity is always debatable. If you use data from 1950 to 2010, you can reasonably wonder, but are the results relevant now? If you use data from the 50 US states, you can reasonably wonder, but are the results relevant for Canada, or Germany, or China? If you set up a pristine experiment, the problem just gets worse. The experiment might not even be relevant in the real world the day it was performed. Second, identification is always debatable. Identifying a genuine natural experiment requires wisdom and patience. Plenty of smart people lack one or both. Calling something a natural experiment doesn't make it so. Third, even smart human beings are prone to big, careless mistakes. A paper that seems impeccable to a casual reader might be based on miscoded data, or crucial variable names could have been switched. Fourth, although researchers like to pretend that they base their conclusions purely on the evidence, their priors always matter. If A seems initially obvious to you and paper X confirms A, even researchers who know better must struggle not to say, X shows that A is true. The problem isn't confidence in A, which may be completely warranted. The problem is the pretense that you believe in A because X confirms A, even though you would believe in A no matter how X came out. Fifth, most researchers' priors are heavily influenced by some extremely suspicious factors. Factors like social acceptability, ideological palatability, and what you thought when you were an ignorant teenager. To be clear, I freely admit that some papers are better than others. My claim is simply that the best existing papers are still underwhelming and probably always will be. As St. Paul preaches, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Imagine placing papers on a continuum of convincingness from 0 to 1. 0 provides no information at all. 1 decisively answers its question. At least for questions that anyone cares about, I say the median paper hovers around 0.5. The best papers get up to around 0.20. Again, no paper is that good. If you demur, consider this. In 20 years, will you still hold up the best papers of today as paragons or exemplars of compelling empirical work? If not, you already agree with me. The best papers are relatively good, but absolutely mediocre. And no, you can't just staple 5 top-scoring papers together to hit 1.0. Does all of this hold for my papers too? Of course. The most I can claim is that I am hyper-aware of my own epistemic frailty and have a litany of self-imposed safeguards. But I totally understand why my critics would look at my best papers and say, meh, doesn't really prove anything. Given my grim view of research, how can I remain a professional researcher? By the power of stoicism. I do my best to reach truth despite the fact that no paper is that good. I read voraciously in all the disciplines relevant to the questions on my mind, especially those review articles that Noah holds in low esteem. He's right that research is full of mistakes and bad reasoning. I probably perceive even more mistakes and worse reasoning than he does. But my goal as a reader is to discover whether a paper has anything of value in it. When I toss a paper in the trash, it's mostly because I decide the author doesn't even aspire to answer an important question. More fundamentally, though, I try to set aside controversial priors in favor of common sense, stay calm, and view all my identities with suspicion. And I bet. I wish there were a better way, an algorithm that assures truth. But I see no sign that such an algorithm exists. July 12, 2018. The sense in which I don't trust the media. I ignore the news, in part because I deem it unreliable. That's right, I don't trust the media. But what exactly do I mean by this seemingly conspiratorial statement? All things considered, when I hear the media report on direct observations, I believe them. If they say rioting is happening in D.C., I am highly confident that rioting is happening in D.C. If they quote a politician, I am highly confident that the politician said the quote. If they say that a person was convicted of a specific crime, I believe that the person was indeed convicted. But my trust largely ends there. When the media makes claims about any of the following, I habitually roll my eyes. 1. Causation. I distrust media claims about causation, about claims like X caused event Y, as well as event X caused Z. If the media says a politician won an election, I believe them. When they try to tell me why the politician won, however, I scoff. If they try to tell me what will happen as a result of the politician's victory, I scoff again. Why? Because causation is notoriously difficult to untangle, and few journalists have the slightest training in causal inference. They are, however, masters of hyperbole. 2. Meaning. I distrust media claims about what events mean, about claims like X shows Y, or X is part of broader trend Z. Why? Because putting any particular event in context requires long-term statistical reasoning, and few journalists have more than mediocre training in statistics. So if journalists claim that a notorious crime illustrates a general pattern about crime, I skeptically shrug. 3. Importance. Whenever the media cover a story, there's a subtext. And the subtext is, this is important. The also goes when the media ignores a story. The subtext is, this is not important. Even if I knew nothing about the world, I would wonder, what qualifies these people to adjudicate events' importance? And since I do know a great deal about the world, I am convinced that the media's sense of importance is radically defective. These are the kind of people who would rather cover an insensitive tweet than Uyghur concentration camps. They would rather report a fatality-free nuclear accident than the vastly greater health damage of coal. They would rather investigate the latest terrorist attack than discuss the global murder rate. These are not isolated shortcomings. The media's main function is to distort viewers' priorities. 4. Politics. Even on utterly apolitical issues, I consider the media deeply unreliable on causation, meaning and importance. Once causation, meaning and importance become political, however, I deem it absurdly, insultingly unreliable. Why? Most obviously, because of the media's overwhelming left-wing bias. You can tell simply by reading the headlines. Diction alone is a dead giveaway. Less obviously because of the media's unthinking nationalism. Despite their cosmopolitan pretensions, even very left-wing journalists are nationalists at heart. That's why a minor terrorist attack against fellow citizens gets 100 times as much attention as mass murder of foreigners. That's why token cuts in domestic welfare programs outrage the media 100 times as much as massive cuts in the admission of refugees. When critics attack the media as globalist, it's a case of 99% nationalists lashing out at 90% nationalists. Personally, I should add, journalists almost always treat me well. When they interview me, they're not just consistently fair and respectful, they also accurately report my positions. What gives? Much of the reason must be self-selection. Journalists who interview me tend to be favorably disposed. A secondary reason, though, is that journalistic vices are often a response to consumer demand. On some level, most journalists know that plane crashes are grossly overcovered. But alas, if it bleeds, it leads. In a one-on-one conversation, though, the media is more thoughtful and open-minded than their output suggests. Another possibility, admittedly, is that when you interview someone as averse to social desirability bias as myself, you can get a good story without bending the truth. December 2nd, 2020. A conservative confession. Few psychological results are as well-grounded as hedonic adaptation. Human beings often have strong short-run reactions to even mild stimuli. An ice cream cone can put a huge grin on our faces. Missing a red light can make us scream with rage. In the long run, however, human beings' emotional reactions to even extreme stimuli soften to a shocking degree. If you won millions in the lottery, the thrill would soon fade. If your girlfriend dumped you, the pain of that would soon fade too. Hedonic adaptation isn't perfect, but it is a mighty psychological force. I'm weird in many ways, but as far as I can tell, my hedonic adaptation is quite normal. Indeed, my only visible abnormality is self-awareness. I know that I'm going to hedonically adapt to most good and bad life events, so I place little stock in life events, and I get impatient with people who refuse to do the same. So what? Well, all this leads to an uncomfortable epiphany. Intellectually, I'm convinced that even liberal democratic societies are deeply unjust. Logically, for example, the analogy between Jim Crow and immigration restrictions seems apt, but psychologically speaking, I can still get used to this injustice. Indeed, I've long since done so. So what politically aggravates me? Change in the wrong direction. Though I do my best to regulate my own emotions, I fall short of perfect stoicism. The upshot: even though my political views are deeply unconservative, the honest truth is that if existing justices and injustices were locked in place forever, I would personally be happier. When the world stops changing, it's easy to accept the world as it is. What does this justify? Nothing, of course, but don't say that I only feel this way because my life is fine. Plenty of people with far more than me are filled with rage. Plenty of people with vastly less than me live relaxed, carefree lives. Why? Epicurus elegantly explained it millennia ago. What inspires positive and negative emotion is not so much our situation as the gap between our situation and our expectations. The lower your standards, the better you'll feel. And that is my conservative confession. December 11th, 2018. Impasse. I've spent over 30 years arguing about ideas. During those decades, I've learned a lot. I've changed my mind. I've changed minds. Normally, however, arguing about ideas is fruitless. Tempers fray. Discussion goes in circles. Each and every mental corruption that Philip Tetlock has explained rears its ugly epistemic head. You even lose friends. When a conversation goes off the rails, I'm sorely tempted to bluntly assess the other party's deep intellectual flaws. As I repeatedly barked at my mom when I was a teenager, when will you get it through your thick skull that? 2. You don't have to master Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People to predict the results. The other party typically has the temerity to bluntly assess my deep intellectual flaws, which in turn sparks an even more unpleasant, fruitless, and potentially friendship-ending exchange. The wise approach to fruitless argument, rather, is to politely disengage. Yet how can you do this without counterproductively moving the conversation from bad to worse? The classic move is to make one last point, then terminate the conversation. Again, you don't have to master Carnegie to predict the results. The other side rushes to get in their one last point, and the cycle of suffering resumes. A better approach is to meekly announce, "I can't think of anything else productive to say." Alas, this is still red meat in the eyes of many disputants. Aha, so you can't even answer my brilliant arguments. Typical. The best ejector button I've discovered so far is a single word: impasse. You can stretch it out to, "I fear we've reached an impasse," but even that provides a handhold for the other party to say, "Oh, we've reached an impasse, eh? Speak for yourself." When you say impasse and stop talking, the conversation swiftly ends. The other side won't like it, but at this point, you should meet further taunts with a silent shrug. While this might spawn a grudge, it's less likely to do so than further wasted words. Admittedly, if your real goal is to manipulate the other party into purging you, your best bet is probably agree and amplify. But if that's your goal, you have no need of my help. November 9th, 2020. Get a compound. Critics of libertarianism frequently fault us for ignoring the value of community. Libertarians may be perfectly happy living in a society bound together by nothing stronger than, "I'll leave you alone, you leave me alone." But psychologically normal humans crave a sense of deep belonging, a sense only big government satisfies. On the surface, it's a plausible story. I've always been weirdly individualistic. I never fit in with my classmates or neighborhood kids. Even Princeton's PhD econ program wasn't nerdy enough for me. If you're a lifelong outsider, libertarianism sounds very nice. For everyone else, however, it sounds like a threat to the meaning of life. The more I think about this story, though, the weaker it seems. The million-dollar question: if people really crave a sense of deep belonging, how come almost no one voluntarily lives in compounds, also known as intentional communities? 1. If you're a Christian, why not live in an all-Christian apartment block? If you're a Green, why not live in an all-Green commune? If you're an American nationalist, why not live in an all-American nationalist housing development? Yes, it's conceivable your restrictive covenants will face some legal hurdles, but where there's a will, there's usually a way. If you want to live on a compound, your main problem isn't that you'll get sued by hostile elements trying to crash your party. Your main problem is that you'll search in vain for like-minded people who want to join you. Indeed, suppose a compound of like-minded people were already up and running. How much extra rent would you be willing to pay per month to experience deep belonging? Critics will probably dismiss this economic reductionism, but that's hardly fair. When people rent apartments or buy homes, they're happy to shell out extra money to live in richer areas, safer areas, more interesting areas. Property developers strive to accommodate not only these common desires, but more obscure preferences for golf communities, 55 and better communities, pristine communities, and much more. Why then do developers deliver so few deep belonging communities? The nigh inescapable answer: because there's little demand for them. When deciding where to live, psychologically normal humans spend dollars like individualists. True, most people aren't rhetorically individualistic, but actions speak louder than words. When people talk like collectivists but spend like individualists, social desirability bias is the natural explanation. The prevalence of communitarian talk shows normal people want to sound like communitarians. The absence of compounds shows people want to live like individualists. Governments deliver what people pretend to want. Free markets deliver what people actually want. Disagree? Then get a compound. Raise your identity flag high and count yourself lucky. Communitarians can get most of the community they lack by convincing a room full of like-minded folks to join them. Individualists can't get the freedom they lack unless they miraculously convince the world's communities to leave them alone. March 23, 2016. Purges and Schisms. I wrote this in 1993. Still seems correct to me, and unfortunately it's as relevant as ever. Purges and Schisms. When I was working this summer at the Institute for Humane Studies, I spent many hours reading old libertarian periodicals, especially those from the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And one of the things that struck me was the frequency and violence of the purges and schisms. Of course, I'd been familiar with the Rand-related purges and schisms for a long time. Now, I bring this up not to point fingers at this or that faction. Rather, I want to discuss the harmful effects of purges and schisms and propose some tentative remedies. Secondarily, I'd like to open up further discussion on ways to avoid future purges and schisms. The damage of purges and schisms. First of all, purges and schisms take up a lot of time and energy that could be better spent on constructive tasks. I can't tell you how many issues of various libertarian publications that I read were devoted exclusively to falling outs, betrayals, and selling outs. Every one of these articles could have been turned to some positive task, whether current events in the world or history, public policy, philosophy, or what have you. Oftentimes, those writing the book-length purge statements were great minds who produced excellent work before they embroiled themselves in infighting. Second, purges and schisms prevent great minds and schools of thought from teaching one another. Cross-fertilization is the term that comes to mind. Frequently, the best ideas lie scattered in the works of many thinkers. In an open and tolerant intellectual atmosphere, everyone would feel comfortable to bring the best ideas together to synthesize. Every new idea would have the benefit of criticism from many perspectives. Purges and schisms tend to put a stop to this beneficent process. Of course, it is conceivable that a person might be purged, but not his or her works. Conceivable, but rare. I noticed that every side in every schism tended to rewrite history, downplaying or even scorning the works of the intellectual exiles. Strange as it sounds, Ayn Rand's treatment of Nathaniel Branden was actually better than average. At least, she kept his essays in the virtue of selfishness and capitalism, the unknown ideal, though of course, she and her inner circle never cited him again, to my knowledge. It was more typical for former friends who eagerly referred to one another's work before a schism to forever afterwards ignore it completely, or even scorn it. Third, purges and schisms seriously turn off newcomers. When someone first acquires an interest in libertarianism, he or she wants to learn, listen, and discuss ideas. When they see that more seasoned libertarians seem more interested in people, they will understandably be turned off. At its worst, it makes libertarians seem more like a cult than a community of thoughtful people who value individual liberty. Fourth, only very rarely did I find a purge or schism based on some real horrible sellout or defection to another political philosophy. There were roughly two kinds of fallings out. The first kind was the clash of personalities. Obviously, some people, especially passionate, ideological people, can get on each other's nerves. This often led to schisms and purges. Especially if one of the people involved was well known in the libertarian movement, they usually dragged all of their followers and supporters into the fray, creating permanent ruptures. The second kind of falling out was genuinely based on ideological differences, but blown all out of proportion. There seems to be an instinct to assume that those who disagree with you, or, even worse, who change their minds and cease to agree with you, must do so out of sheer wickedness. Throughout all of the battles that I studied, it is difficult to remember a single case where I was convinced that someone had dishonestly taken on a new intellectual stance. Of course, I often agreed with one side and disagreed with the other, but that is not the point. The point is that all of the sides seemed like they were probably sincere, yet libertarian thinkers and activists who had often known each other for years jumped to the conclusion of willful intellectual dishonesty. Now, of course, a concern for ideological purity in some sense can be quite reasonable. If Lyndon LaRouche called himself a libertarian, which I don't think he ever did, it would upset me, and I would surely tell others that he wasn't. But in all of the cases I studied, the disagreements never took any of the participants outside of the classical liberal tradition. Their disagreements might not have been minor, though some were, but they definitely remained disagreements within a body of thinkers with many shared beliefs and concerns. A proposed remedy of purges and schisms. Now I am convinced that this plague of purges and schisms is one of the most serious long-run problems within the libertarian movement, and I want to do something about it. Moreover, I think that any viable solutions must have two properties. First, any individual who adopts the solution will marginally make purges and schisms less common, acrimonious, and harmful to the libertarian movement. Second, if the solution were to become widely accepted among libertarians, the problem of purges and schisms would for the most part disappear. Those familiar with game theory will see why the two are not necessarily linked. What then is my proposed solution? 1. In the event of a disagreement, to always criticize only the ideas, never the person, and moreover, to always criticize in a polite and ecumenical way. 2. If another libertarian fails to live up to number 1, to still refrain from making any sort of personal attack or responding in a similar way. I realize that this will be controversial. Initially, I balked at this idea myself. It seems to go against everything Robert Axelrod said in The Evolution of Cooperation. Namely, the best way to get golden rule behavior is not by following the golden rule, but by playing tit for tat. But this impression is only superficial. Oftentimes, those who make personal attacks get pleasure out of infighting for its own sake, so responding in kind may just encourage them. Moreover, there are many better sanctions to impose: loss of reputation, loss of credibility on serious, i.e. non-purge, schism issues, etc. And on top of this, remaining polite and respectful on principle is somewhat likely to get others to respond in kind. It is hard to keep calling someone names if they just ignore it and answer your real argument. On top of this, there are third-party effects. When you refuse to engage in personal attacks, even when you seem to have every justification to do so, onlookers will be impressed by your commitment to discuss only ideas and listen only to reasonable arguments. 3. To never initiate a purge or schism. If you don't like someone, don't hang around them. If you disagree with their work, criticize it or ignore it. But don't go beyond this. Don't write denouncements. Don't discourage people from at least reading their works. And don't make people feel like they are either for you or against you. Now, when I first considered this idea, I was worried that the libertarian movement would suddenly be filled with every sort of nut, followers of Lyndon LaRouche, Holocaust revisionists, the works. But then I thought again, is there not a spontaneous ordering in ideological movements as well as in society? Indeed there is. No one is going to start calling himself a libertarian unless he has some interest in libertarian ideas. No one is going to take the trouble to engage in dialogue with libertarians if they completely disagree with us. There are market forces, if you will, that automatically create a reasonable degree of uniformity within every ideological movement, whether there are purges and schisms or not. What are these market forces? Simply the affinity of like-minded people for each other's company and association. And I think that this force is more than strong enough to give the libertarian movement all of the cohesiveness that it needs. 4. If you are the victim of a purge or schism, refuse to acknowledge its importance. Continue to read and cite the valuable works of those who purged you. Continue to encourage others to read them for themselves. If you have followers, don't drag them in or treat it as a personal betrayal if they retain an interest in the works of those who purged you. Just continue your normal, steady stream of positive, constructive work and don't worry about it. No reasonable person will think less of you if you refuse to get into the fray. Naturally, you may respond to criticisms of your ideas, and if some specific factual charges are made against you, e.g., that you are a plagiarist or embezzled funds, by all means issue a reply. But keep it short and concentrate on ideas, not people. I'm not certain that my solution is perfect, but it seems to me to be a necessary first step. The more I read old periodicals, the more the present seemed to look just like the past, and the more the present groupings of libertarians began to make historical sense. As a small minority voice, libertarians can't afford to waste their energy on anything other than building a complete intellectual alternative to the status quo. February 25th, 2015. The Social Conservatism of Hollywood. The new Uncut Gems is further evidence for a thesis I've long maintained. Contrary to popular opinion, Hollywood makes a lot of socially conservative movies. When you strip away the glamorous actors and cool music, the message is clear. Live a responsible bourgeois life, or you will soon be severely punished. This is most obvious for hard-boiled crime films. The lead characters in such stories engage in an array of impulsive, brutal, and parasitical behaviors. Before the movie ends, almost all of the characters have been shot, stabbed, beaten, imprisoned, or ostracized. Many are dead, often in grotesquely inventive ways. Howard Ratner, the lead character in Uncut Gems, repeatedly commits fraud and adultery. He spins a web of lies and makes high-stakes gambles. In each scene, he acts on his worst impulses. For every success his duplicity brings, 2 failures spring. When he thinks he's won, another criminal murders him. Even if Ratner had survived, though, his dishonesty and lechery would have cost him his family. The same goes for the Godfather saga, Goodfellas, or any Scorsese crime movie, Pulp Fiction, or any Tarantino crime movie, Fargo, or any Coen Brothers crime movie, Snatch, or any Cockney crime movie, as well as Scarface, New Jack City, and Boys in the Hood. In crime movies, people who engage in criminal behavior suffer, usually at the hands of their fellow criminals. If they don't get you, the cops will. While crime movies focus on men, their female characters also catch hell. Women who sleep with criminals, usually against their family's advice, end up pregnant and abandoned, if not beaten or murdered. Don Corleone treats his wife with old-world gentility, but she still lives to see her eldest son full of lead. Michael, her youngest son, has the filial piety to delay the murder of his elder brother until after her death. The message of all this cinema: follow the path of bourgeois virtue. Work hard, keep the peace, abstain from alcohol, have very few sexual partners, and keep your whole family far away from anyone who lives otherwise. Think about how many fictional characters would have lived longer if they never set foot in a bar. Is this the message the writers intend to send? Unlikely. Instead, they try to create engrossing stories and end up weaving morality tales. True, Hollywood could make movies where criminals are victims of their toxic social environment. It could make movies where the people who face retribution are the self-righteous bourgeoisie who created toxic social environment in the first place. This is arguably the plot of Natural-Born Killers, though that's giving it too much credit. Such stories, however, would be sorely lacking in emotional truth. You can't credibly depict the life of a criminal without showing his choices. And when you see his choices, you see all the ways he could have done otherwise. Toxic social environment notwithstanding. Similarly, you could make crime movies that end before the criminals get their comeuppance. Yet such stories would be dramatically inert. If a bank robber gets killed on his 8th heist, audiences want to see heists number 1, 2, and 8. If the bad guy gets it in the end, who cares about his intermediate successes? Let's fast forward to the day of reckoning. Does this mean that Hollywood movies actually reduce crime? I doubt it. The viewers most in need of lessons in bourgeois virtue are probably too impulsive to reflect on the moral of the story. They're captivated instead by the gunplay and machismo. Yet if you're paying attention, the moral of these stories remains. Unless your parents are criminals, listen to your parents. December 30th, 2019. To cut or not to cut. When I was finishing up The Myth of the Rational Voter, I weighed whether I should cut the paragraph on restricting the franchise. But what, if anything, can be done to improve outcomes, taking the supremacy of democracy over the market as fixed? The answer depends on how flexibly you define democracy. Would we still have a democracy if you needed to pass a test of economic literacy to vote? If you needed a college degree? Both of these measures raise the economic understanding of the median voter, leading to more sensible policies. Franchise restrictions were historically used for discriminatory ends, but that hardly implies that they should never be used again for any reason. A test of voter competence is no more objectionable than a driving test. Both bad driving and bad voting are dangerous, not merely to the individual who practices them, but to innocent bystanders. I knew this paragraph might provoke hysterical hostility, but I thought that A, it made a good point, and B, angry reactions would confirm my broader thesis that many people are democratic fundamentalists. In the end, it made the cut, and probably ended up being the single most discussed paragraph in the book. Radio hosts brought it up again and again. Now that I'm finishing up Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, another controversial passage is on the chopping block. In the current draft, this paragraph concludes my discussion of cloning. I confess that I take anti-cloning arguments personally. Not only do they insult the identical twin sons I already have, they insult a son I hope I live to meet. Yes, I wish to clone myself and raise the baby as my son. Seriously. I want to experience the sublime bond I'm sure we'd share. I'm confident that he'd be delighted too, because I would love to be raised by me. I'm not pushing others to clone themselves. I'm not asking anyone else to pay for my dream. I just want government to leave me and the cloning business alone. Is that too much to ask? My reasons to keep it as before are A, it makes a good point, and B, angry reactions would confirm my broader thesis that many people senselessly oppose assisted reproductive technology. The downside, of course, is alienating otherwise sympathetic readers. The upside of the downside is that controversy is excellent publicity. Should my cloning confession make the final cut? Advise me. Update. Check out my additional comments on Emarster. My prediction. Once a few thousand cloned humans are walking the earth, sneering at clones and people who want them will become as gauche as sneering at IVF babies and people who want them. April 20th, 2010. My short class autobiography. I grew up in an upper-middle-class family in a suburb of Los Angeles. My father earned his PhD in electrical engineering when I was 5. My mom went to college part-time at CSUN and finished her bachelor's degree in English a few years later. 3 of my 4 grandparents went to college. My paternal grandfather owned his own pharmacy. My maternal grandfather had a law degree but was employed as a railroad worker. My mom blamed the Depression for her father's failure to find work as a lawyer. My family lived in a nice single-family home with a swimming pool. However, my parents were always frugal. We never bought new cars until I finished high school. Our vacations consisted almost entirely in camping, and my weekly allowance was $0.5 per year of age. Later, I bargained for a raise to $0.07 per year of age. Their fiscal restraint allowed my parents to invest in real estate, buying several homes as rental properties. I went to public school for my entire K-12 education, with the exception of 4th grade, when my parents put me in a private Greek Orthodox school to avoid being bused. I was always a good student, and fortunately, my elementary school offered ability tracking beginning in 1st or 2nd grade, if I recall correctly. By junior high, I considered non-ability track classes to be not only a waste of time, but very distressing. The regular kids, as I called them, were generally anti-intellectual and impulsive. There wasn't much physical abuse, but there was a lot of emotional abuse, and the less I saw of the regular kids, the better. Many readers will attribute my school performance and attitudes to my class background, but this is a deep mistake. True, virtually all of the students in my ability groups came from middle-class families, but most of the regular kids were middle-class too, and I always saw my older brother, a mediocre student, as one of the regular kids. Furthermore, both of my parents discouraged my elitist attitudes, but I just ignored them. My friends growing up all came from roughly the same social class as I did. The class background of my friends diversified only after I went to college. My best friend from my undergraduate days at UC Berkeley was the only son of immigrants from Latin America. My best friend from my time as a graduate student at Princeton came from a very poor family in the Poconos. But our class differences made no difference to us. Our common intellectual interests, values, and sense of humor were the glue of our friendship. My childhood would have been much worse if I had grown up poor, but frankly, I doubt that my adult life would have been very different. As long as I had enough to eat, poverty per se wouldn't have bothered me much. But based on my experience with on-ability tracked classes, I would have been friendless and bored out of my mind. These days, perhaps, I could have found solace on the internet at a public school or library. By the time I finished high school, though, there would probably have been plenty of scholarship money available to me. Even if there weren't, I would have been fanatically motivated to put myself through college in order to escape from my origins. You could say that growing up poor would have stifled my mental development, but I doubt it. Twin and adoption studies show that childhood environment has little or no long-run effect on IQ. You could say that growing up poor would have changed my attitudes, but I'm a difficult person to mold. I'm an atheist despite 16 years of my mother's Catholic indoctrination. If anything, I think that growing up poor would have made me more elitist than I already am, just as growing up Catholic made me more impious. For my adult life to have been radically different, I would probably have needed to grow up in an absolutely poor family in the third world, not a relatively poor family in the first world. My instinct in that situation would be to learn English and migrate to the US, but immigration restrictions would get in the way. This realization is part of the reason I have so much more sympathy for immigrants than I do for low-skilled Americans. What if I had grown up rich? Again, I doubt it would have changed much. I would have gone to the Ivy League instead of UC Berkeley, but it's not like Berkeley held me back. Perhaps I would have been less ambitious if I came from a rich family, but who knows? From what I've seen, the standard function of class autobiography is to make middle and upper class authors feel guilty and the lower and working class authors feel resentful. But reflecting on my class history doesn't make me feel guilty. Rather, it confirms the common sense view that in the long run, differences in ability and character are the cause of class differences, and not the other way around. Scoff if you must. May 27, 2006. Scion of Tax Consumers, my Calhounian class autobiography. I was born into a family of tax consumers. My father was an engineer for a defense contractor during the last decades of the Cold War. My mom was a substitute teacher for the public schools, though she did spend a year working full-time at a Catholic school. We were not entirely insulated from the market. My parents invested in real estate. My dad ran a small antique cars business on the side, but the large majority of our income came from government, federal, state, and local. And aside from a year of private school to avoid being bussed, my K-12 schooling was entirely supplied by the public sector. My status as a tax consumer continued during my undergraduate years at UC Berkeley. Since I was a Regents Scholar, I received an even larger subsidy from the state of California than the typical UC student. During my PhD program at Princeton, I spent 4 years employed by what one could technically call the private sector. You would never know the university was private from being there, though. If anything, the lack of a bottom line and sense of entitlement were more prominent than at Berkeley. Once I graduated, I became an employee of the state of Virginia's George Mason University, which eventually gave me a job for life. Since my wife is a corporate lawyer, most of my family income officially comes from the private sector. But few private sector professions profit as much from expansive government as lawyers do. Anyone can see that plaintiffs' lawyers for antitrust cases benefit from the existence of antitrust. A little reflection reveals that defendants' lawyers for antitrust benefit as well. On further reflection, it is clear that increasing the demand for antitrust lawyers increases the demand for lawyers in general. So, how much do I actually profit from expansive government? The question is harder than it looks, because you have to keep opportunity cost in mind. A bureaucrat earning $100 per year might be able to get an equal salary in the private sector. If tax cuts eliminated his position, his after-tax salary would actually rise as a result. In my case, though, it's hard to deny that I really am a net beneficiary. I greatly enjoy being a professor, so if government cut its subsidies for education, I wouldn't readily flee to a more lucrative occupation. In any case, I'm almost middle-aged. Starting a new career at this point would be both costly and stressful. How has my Calhounian class background affected my beliefs about the world? In truth, it's hard to see how it has. Even before I knew a thing about economics or libertarianism, I never thought of myself as playing for the government team. My next book argues that government subsidies for education are a big waste of money. Growing up, there were obvious, though mostly apolitical, differences in attitude between kids from rich versus poor families. But it's hard to recall any attitudinal difference, political or otherwise, between kids from tax consumer versus tax producer families. Of course, my introspection is fallible. If I can find some good data, I'll follow up with a few simple statistical tests. Not convinced? Suppose someone from a rich family wanted to marry someone from a poor family. Even today, it is easy to believe that the rich parents, and maybe even the poor parents, would resist. We're not snobs. But, in contrast, suppose that someone from a rich entrepreneurial family wanted to marry someone from a rich bureaucratic family. It's hard to imagine anyone seriously pointing out the divide, much less using it as an argument against a union. Ultimately, then, while regular class analysis seems oversold, Calhounian class analysis seems almost irrelevant in modern America. Objectively speaking, tax consumers and tax producers may have a lot to fight about, but subjectively speaking, it's a rare person who even notices. April 22, 2007. What life experience taught me about religion? It's very unpleasant to be an irreligious kid in a religious family. Every week, if not more often, you have to remain silent in the presence of dogmatic nonsense. You can't get things off your chest during the Q&A session, F. Most religions don't have them, and most religious people don't appreciate them. If you challenge your family members, your chances of getting a straight answer, or even a civil one, are pretty low. At least that's how things were for me when I was a teenage atheist. My response, from age 15 to 19 or so, was to wage a one-man intellectual war on religion. I didn't just object to religious claims that happened to come my way. I was on search and destroy mode, vainly trying to argue every crucifix wearer onto the path of reason. I haven't changed my mind about the folly of religion, but I have learned a happy lesson since my teenage days. At least in modern America, it's easy for an adult to live a secular life. Yes, most people are nominally Christian, but their proselytizing era has been over for at least a century. I can't remember the last time a religious person even broached the topic of religion with me, much less attempted to give me an unwanted sermon. But this is just my personal experience, you say? Well, look at mainstream television, or movies, or music. They're the masses' primary form of entertainment, and their religious content is near zero. Of course, religious TV shows do exist, but only in easily avoided cultural ghettos like the Christian Broadcasting Network. Early Christians tried to be the light of the world. Modern Christians preach to the choir. Here are two examples that nicely illustrate my point. If you drive past a nearby Catholic church, its big roadside banner reads, "Inactive Catholics, rediscover your faith." Talk about a soft sell. If you already agree with us, but don't attend church, we'd love to see you here. Another example, if you wander the streets of NYC and look like me, some ultra-Orthodox Jewish teens will eventually approach you and ask, "Are you Jewish?" If you say no, they wave goodbye. If you want more details, here's a true story about my encounter with the aforementioned ultra-Orthodox Jewish teens. "Sir, are you Jewish?" "I'm ethnically Jewish." "Ethically Jewish?" "Everyone is ethically Jewish." "No, I said I'm ethnically Jewish." "Why do you say that?" "Me, 'cause my father is Jewish." Have a nice day. If you are completely baffled by this anecdote, remember that Jewish religious identity is matrilineal. My point is simple. Life as a teenage atheist led me to grossly exaggerate the lifetime burden religion was going to impose on me. At least in the modern US, once you leave home and build your own life, religion will probably leave you alone if you leave it alone. In fact, even if you want to crusade against religion, you're going to have to make an effort to find people who don't just run away to talk amongst themselves. P.S. If you say, "What about the pro-life movement?" or "What about intelligent design?" I'm going to say, availability bias. In fact, I'm tempted to give the same response if you say Islamic terrorism, though I admit that's a tougher case. June 4th, 2008.